Section 1 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Aidan Fitzgerald. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 2. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 1, Claude Gueux, by Victor Hugo. 7 or 8 years ago, a man by the name of Claude Gueux, a poor artisan, was living in Paris. He had with him a girl who was his mistress and a child by this girl. I tell things as they were, leaving the reader to gather the moral for himself, as the facts of my story bring it before him. The artisan was skillful, quick, intelligent, very ill-treated by education, very well-treated by nature, able to think but not to read. One winter his work failed him. There was neither fire nor food in his garret. The man, the girl, and the child were cold and hungry. He committed a theft. I know not what he stole, or whence he stole it. I only know that the consequences of this theft were 3 days' food and fire to the girl and the child, and 5 years' imprisonment to the man. He was sent to undergo his sentence at the House of Correction at Clairvaux, an abbey changed into a jail, a cell changed into a prison cage, an altar changed into a pillory. When we speak of change, it is thus that certain persons understand and execute it. Such a meaning do they give to the word. To proceed. When arrived there, he was placed in a dungeon at night and in a workshop by day. I have no quarrel with the workshop. Claude Gueux, lately an honest man, now and henceforth a thief, was dignified and grave in appearance. His high forehead was already wrinkled. Though he was still young, some gray lines lurked among the black and bushy tufts of his hair. His eye was soft and buried deep beneath his lofty and well-turned eyebrows. His nostrils were open, his chin advancing, his lip scornful. It was a fine head. We shall see what society made of it. He was a man of few words, more frequent gestures, somewhat imperious in his whole manner, and one to make himself obeyed, of a melancholy air, rather serious than suffering. For all that, he had suffered enough. In the place where he was confined, there was a director of the workrooms, a kind of functionary peculiar to prisons, who combined in himself the offices of turnkey and tradesman, who would at the same time ensue an order to the worksman and threaten the prisoner, put tools in his hands and irons on his feet. This man was a variety of his own species, a man peremptory, tyrannical, governed by his fancies, holding tight the reins of his authority, and yet on occasion a boon companion, jovial and condescending to a joke, rather hard than firm, reasoning with no one, not even himself, a good father, and doubtless a good husband. A duty, by the way, and not a virtue. In short, evil, but not bad. The principle, the diagonal line of this man's character was obstinacy. He was proud of it, and therein compared himself to Napoleon. When he had once fixed what he called his will upon an absurdity, he went to its furthest length, holding his head high and despising all obstacles. Such violence of purpose without reason is only folly tied to the tail of brute force and serving to lengthen it. For the most part, whenever a catastrophe, whether public or private, happens among men, if we look beneath the rubbish with which it strews the earth, to find in what manner the fallen fabric had been propped, we shall, with rare exceptions, discover it to have been blindly put together by a weak and obstinate man, trusting and admiring himself implicitly. Many of the smaller of these fatalities pass in the world for providences. Such was he who was the director of the workrooms in the central prison of Clairvaux. Such was the stone with which society daily struck its prisoners to draw sparks from them. The sparks which such stones draw from such flints often kindle conflagrations. We have said that once having arrived at Clairvaux, Claude Gueux was classed in a workroom and kept to hard labor. The director became acquainted with him, perceived that he worked well, and treated him accordingly. It even appeared that one day, being in a good humor, and seeing Claude very sad, for he was always thinking upon her whom he called his wife, he told him, by way of amusing as well as consoling him, that the unfortunate creature had become a woman of the town. Claude asked coldly what had become of the child. He did not know. In a short time, Claude found the prison air natural to him, and appeared to have forgotten everything. A certain severe serenity, which belonged to his character, resumed its mastery. In the same time, he had acquired a singular ascendancy over all his companions, as if by a sort of silent agreement, and without anyone knowing wherefore, not even himself. All these men consulted him, listened to him, admired and imitated him, the last point to which admiration can mount. It was no slight glory to be obeyed by all. These lawless natures, the empire, had come to him without his seeking. It was the consequence of the respect with which they beheld him. The eye of a man is a window, through which may be seen the thoughts which enter into and issue from his heart. Place an individual who possesses ideas among those who do not. At the end of a given time, and by law of irresistible attraction, all their misty minds shall draw together with humility and reverence round his illuminated one. There are men who are iron, and there are men who are lodestone. Claude was leadstone. In less than 3 months, he had become the soul, the law, the order of the workroom. He was the dial, concentrating all rays. He must even himself have sometimes doubted whether he were king or prisoner. It was the captivity of a pope among his cardinals. By his natural reaction, accomplished step by step, as he was loved by the prisoners, so is he detested by the jailers. It is always thus. Popularity cannot exist without this favor. The love of the slaves is always exceeded 1 degree by the hate of the masters. Claude was, by his particular organization, a great eater. His stomach was so formed that food enough for 2 common men would hardly have sufficed for his nourishment. Monsieur du Catadilla had one of these large appetites, and laughed at it. But that which is a cause of gaiety for a Spanish Gondy, with his 500,000 sheep, is a heavy charge to an artisan, and a misfortune to a prisoner. Claude Gueux, free in his own loft, worked all day, earned his 4 pounds of bread, and ate it. In his prison he worked all day, and for his pains received 1.5 pounds of bread, and 4 ounces of meat. The ration admits of no change. Claude was therefore constantly hungry while in the prison of Clairvaux. He was hungry and no more. He did not speak of it, because it was not his nature so to do. One day, Claude, after devouring his scanty pittance, had returned to his work, thinking to cheat his hunger by it. The rest of the prisoners were eating cheerily. A young man, pale, fair, and feeble-looking, came and placed himself near him. He held in his hand his ration, as yet untouched, and a knife. He remained in that situation with the air of one who would speak and dares not. The sight of the man and his bread and meat annoyed Claude. "What do you want?" said he rudely. "That you would do me a service," said the young man timidly. "What?" replied Claude. "That you would help me eat this. It is too much for me." A tear stood in the proud eye of Claude. He took the knife, divided the young man's ration into 2 equal parts, took one of them, and began eating. "Thank you," said the young man. "If you like, we shall share together every day." "What is your name?" said Claude. "Alban." "Wherefore are you here?" "I have committed a theft." "And I, too," said Claude. Henceforth, They did thus share together every day. Claude Gueux was a little more than 30 years old, but at times he appeared 50. So stern were his thoughts usually. Alban was 20. He might have been taken for 17. So much innocence was there in his appearance of this thief. A strict friendship was knit up between the two, rather of father to son than brother to brother. Alban being still almost a child, Claude already nearly an old man. They wrought in the same workroom, they slept under the same vault. They walked in the same airing ground, they ate of the same bread. Each of these two friends was the universe to each other. It would seem that they were happy. We have already spoken of the director of the workrooms. This man, who was abhorred by the prisoners, was often obligated, in order to enforce obedience, to have recourse to Claude Gueux, who was beloved by them. On more than one occasion, when the question was how to put down a rebellion or tumult, the authority without title of Claude Gueux had given a powerful aid to the official authority of the director. In short, to restrain the prisoners, 10 words from him were as good as 10 gendarmes. Claude had many times rendered this service to the director, wherefore the latter detested him cordially. He was jealous of this thief. There was at the bottom of his heart a secret, envious, implacable hatred against Claude. The hate of a titular for a real sovereign, of a temporal against a spiritual power. These are the worst of all hatreds. Claude loved Alban greatly, and did not trouble himself about the directors. One morning when the turnkeys were leading their prisoners 2 by 2 from their dormitory to the workroom, one of them called Alban, who was by the side of Claude, and informed him that the director asked for him. "What does he want with you?" said Claude. "I do not know," replied the other. The turnkey took Alban away. The morning passed. Alban did not return to the workroom. When the dinner hour arrived, Claude expected that he should rejoin Alban in the airing ground, but no Alban was there. He returned into the workroom. Still, Alban did not make his appearance, so passed the day. At night, when the prisoners were removed to their dormitory, Claude looked about for Alban, but could not see him. It would seem that he must have suffered much at that moment, for he addressed the turnkey, a thing which he had never done before. "Is Alban sick?" was his question. "No," replied the turnkey. "Why is it then that he has not made his appearance today?" "Ah," replied the turnkey carelessly, "they have put him in another ward." The witnesses who disposed to these facts at a later period remarked that at this answer, Claude's hand, in which was a lighted candle, trembled a little. He asked again calmly, "Whose order was this?" The turnkey said, "Monsieur Des." The name of the director of the workrooms was Des. The next day went by like the last, but no Alban. That evening, when the day's work was ended, the director, Monsieur Des, came to make his usual round of inspection. As soon as Claude saw him, he took off his cap of coarse wool, buttoned his gray vest, sad livery of Clairvaux. It is a principle in prisons that a vest, respectfully buttoned, bespeaks the favor of the superior officers, and placed himself at the end of his bench, waiting till the director came by. He passed. "Sir," said Claude. The director stopped and turned halfway round. "Sir," said Claude, "is it true that Alban's ward has been changed?" "Yes," returned the director. "Sir," continued Claude, "I cannot live without Alban. You know that with the ration of the house I have not enough to eat, and that Alban shared his bread with me." "That was his business," replied the director. "Sir, are there no means of getting Alban replaced in the same ward as myself?" "Impossible. It is so decided." "By whom?" "By myself." "Monsieur Des, the question is my life and death. It depends upon you." I never revoke my decisions. Sir, is it because I have given you any offense? None. In that case, said Claude, why do you separate me from Alban? It is my will, said the director. With this explanation, he went away. Claude stooped his head and made no answer. Poor caged lion, from whom they had taken his dog. We are obligated to confess that the grief of this separation in no way changed the prisoner's almost disease of veracity. Nor was he in other respects obviously altered. He did not speak of Alban to any of his comrades. He walked alone in the airing ground, in the hours of recreation, and suffered hunger, nothing more. Nevertheless, those who knew him well remarked something of a sinister and somber expression, which daily overspread his countenance more and more. In other respects, he was gentler than ever. Many wished to share their ration with him. He refused with a smile. Every evening after the explanation which the director had given him, he committed a sort of folly, which, in so grave a man, was astonishing. At the moment when the director, in the progress of his habitual duty, passed by Claude's working frame, he would raise his eyes, gaze steadily upon him, and then address to him in a tone full of distress and anger, combining at once menace and supplication, these two words only, "And Alban?" The director would either appear not to hear, or pass on, shrugging his shoulders. He was wrong. It became evident to all the lookers-on of these strange scenes that Claude was inwardly determined on some step. All the prison awaited with anxiety the result of this strife between obstinacy and resolution. It has been proved that once Claude said to the director, "Listen, sir, give me back my comrade. You will do well to do it, I assure you. Take notice that I tell you." Another time one Sunday, when he had remained in the airing ground for many hours, in the same attitude, seated on a stone, his elbows on his knees, and his forehead buried in his hands, the convict Foyet approached him, and cried out laughing, "What the devil art thou about there, Claude?" Claude raised his head slowly, and said, "I am sitting in judgment." At last, on the evening of the 25th of October, 1831, at the moment when the director was making his round, Claude crushed under his foot a watch-glass, which he had that morning found in the corridor. The director inquired whence that noise proceeded. "It is nothing," said Claude. "It is I, Monsieur le Directeur. Give me back my comrade." "Impossible," said his master. "It must be done, though," said Claude, in a low and steady voice, and looking the director full in the face, added, "Reflect. This is the 25th of October. I give you till the 4th of November." A turnkey made the remark to Monsieur D. that Claude threatened him, and that it was case for solitary confinement. "No, nothing of the kind," said the director, with a disdainful smile. "We must be gentle with these sort of people." On the morrow, the convict Pernod approached Claude, who walked by himself melancholy, leaving the other prisoners to bask in a patch of sunshine at the further corner of the court. "What now, Claude? What art thinking of? Thou seemst sad." "I am afraid," said Claude, "that some misfortune will happen soon to this gentle Monsieur D." There are 9 full days from the 25th of October to the 4th of November. Claude did not let one pass without gravely warning the director of the state, more and more miserable, in which the disappearance of Alban placed him. The director, worn out, sentenced him to 24 hours solitary confinement, because his prayer was too like a damned. This was all Claude obtained. The 4th of November arrived. On this day, Claude arose with such a serene countenance as he had not worn since the day when the decision of Monsieur D had separated him from his friend. When risen, he searched in a white wooden box which stood at the foot of his bed, and contained his few possessions, and drew from thence a pair of seamstress scissors. These, with an odd volume of Émile, were all that remained to him of the woman he had loved, of the mother of his child, of his happy home of other days. 2 articles totally useless to Claude. The scissors could only be of service to a woman, the book to a lettered person. Claude could neither sew nor read. At the time when he was traversing the old cloister, desecrated and blanched, which serves as the winter walk for the prisoners, he approached the convict Ferrari, who was looking with attention at the enormous bars of a window. Claude was holding the little pair of scissors in his hand. He showed them to Ferrari, saying, "Tonight I will divide those bars with these scissors." Ferrari laughed incredulously. Claude joined him. That morning he worked with more zeal than usual, faster and better than before. He appeared to attach a certain importance to completing that morning a straw hat, for which Monsieur Bressier, an honest bourgeois of Troyes, had paid him beforehand. A little past noon, he went down on some pretext or other to the joiner's workshop on the ground floor, under the story in which was his own. Claude was beloved there, as everywhere else, but he entered it seldom. Thus it was, "Stop! Here's Claude!" They got round him. It was a perfect holiday. He cast a quick glance round the room. Not one of the overlookers was there. "Who has a hatchet to lend me?" said he. "What to do?" was the inquiry. "Kill the director of the workrooms." They offered him many to choose from. He took the smallest of those, which were very sharp, hid it in his trousers, and went out. There were 27 prisoners in that room. He had not desired them to keep his secret. They all kept it. They did not even talk of it amongst themselves. Everyone separately awaited the result. The thing was straightforward, terribly simple. Claude could neither be counseled nor denounced. An hour afterward, he approached a convict 16 years old, who was lounging in the place of exercise, and advised him to learn to read. At this moment, the prisoner Fayette spoke to Claude, and asked him what the devil was he hiding there in his trousers. "It is a hatchet," said Claude, "to kill Monsieur D tonight. Can you see it?" "A little," answered Fayette. The rest of the day was as usual. At 7 o'clock at night, the prisoners were shut up, each division in the workroom to which they belonged, and the overlookers went out, as it appears was the custom, not to return till after the director's visit. Claude was locked in with his companions like the rest. Then there passed in this workroom an extraordinary scene, one not without majesty and awe, the only one of the kind which is to be told in this story. There were, according to the judiciary deposition afterward made, 24 thieves, including Claude. As soon as the overlookers had left them alone, Claude stood upon a bench and announced to all the room that he had something to say. There was silence. Then Claude raised his voice and said, "You all know that Alban was my brother. Here they do not give me enough to eat. Even with the bread which I can buy with the little I earn, it is not sufficient. Alban shared his ration with me. I loved him at first because he fed me, then because he loved me. The director, Monsieur D, separated us. Our being together could be nothing to him, but he is a hard-hearted man who enjoys tormenting others. I have asked him for Alban back again. You have heard me. He will not do it. I gave him till the 4th of November to restore Alban to me. He ordered me into solitary confinement for telling him so. I, during this time, have sat in judgment upon him and condemned him to death. We are now at the 4th of November. In 2 hours he will come to make his round. I warn you that I am about to kill him. Have you anything to say on the matter?" All continued silent. He went on. He spoke, so it appears, with a particular eloquence which was natural to him. He declared that he knew he was about to do a violent deed, but could not think it wrong. He appealed to the conscience of his 23 listeners. He was placed in a cruel extremity. The necessity of doing justice to himself was a strait, into which every man finds himself driven at one time or another. He could not, in truth, take the director's life without giving his own for it, but it was right to give his life for a just end. He had thought deeply on the matter, and that alone, for 2 months, he believed he was not carried away by a passion, but if it were so, he trusted they would warn him. He honestly submitted his reasons to the just men whom he addressed. He was about to kill Monsieur D. But if anyone had any objections to make, he was ready to hear it. One voice alone was raised to say that before killing the director, Claude ought to make one last attempt to soften him. "It is fair," said Claude. "I will do so." The great clock struck the hour. It was 8. The director would make his appearance at 9. No sooner had this extraordinary court of appeal ratified the sentence he had submitted to it, than Claude resumed his former serenity. He placed upon the table all the linen and garments he possessed, the scanty property of a prisoner, and calling to him, one after the other, those of his companions whom he loved best after Alban, he divided all among them. He only kept the little pair of scissors. Then he embraced them all. Some of them even wept. Upon these he smiled. There were moments in this last hour when he chatted with so much tranquillity and even gaiety that many of his comrades inwardly hoped, as they afterward declared, that he might perhaps abandon his resolution. He even amused himself with extinguishing one of the few candles which lighted the workroom by blowing through his nostrils, for he had vulgar habits which deranged his natural dignity oftener than they should have done. There were times when he could do nothing which did not smack of the kennels of Paris. He perceived a young convict who was pale, who was gazing upon him with fixed eyes and trembling, doubtless from expectation of what he was about to witness. "Come, courage, young man," said Claude to him softly. "It will only be the work of a moment." When he had distributed all his goods, made all his adieus, pressed all their hands, he interrupted the restless whisperings which were heard here and there in the dim corners of the workroom, and commanded that they should return to their labors. All obeyed him in silence. The apartment in which this passed was an oblong hall, a parallelogram, lighted with windows on its 2 longer sides, with 2 doors opposite to each other at the 2 ends of the room. The working frames were ranged on each side near the windows, the benches touching the wall at right angles, and the space left free between the 2 rows of frames formed a sort of avenue, which went straight from one door to the other, crossing the hall entirely. It was this which the director traversed in making his inspection. He was to enter at the south door and go out by the north. After having looked at the workmen on the right and left, commonly he passed through quickly without stopping. Claude had reseated himself on his bench and had betaken himself to his work as James Clement betook himself to his prayers. All were in expectation. The moment approached. On a sudden they heard the clock strike. Claude said, "It is the last quarter." Then he rose, crossed gravely a part of the hall, and placed himself leaning on his elbow on the first frame on the left side, close to the door of the entrance. His countenance was perfectly calm and benign. 9 o'clock struck. The door opened. The director came in. At that moment, the silence of the workroom was of a chamber full of statues. The director alone was as usual. He entered with his jovial, self-satisfied, and stubborn air, without noticing Claude, who was standing at the left side of the door, his right hand hidden in his trousers, and passing rapidly by the frames, tossing his head, mumbling his words, and casting his glance, which was law, here and there, not perceiving that the eyes of all who surrounded him were fixed upon him as upon a fearful phantom. On a sudden, he turned sharply round, surprised to hear a step behind him. It was Claude, who for some instants followed him in silence. "What art thou about there?" said the director. "What makes thee not in thy place?" Claude Gueux answered respectfully, "Because I have something to say to you, Monsieur le Directeur." "What about?" "Concerning Alban." "Still Alban!" exclaimed the director. "Always," replied Claude. "Be quiet," said the director, walking on again. "Thou art not content, then, with thy 24 hours of solitary confinement?" Claude followed him. "Monsieur le Directeur, give me back my comrade." "Impossible." "Monsieur le Directeur," said Claude in a tone which might have softened a fiend, "I entreat you, restore Alban to me. You shall see how well I will work. To you who are free, it is no matter. You do not know what the worth of a friend is. But I only have the 4 walls of my prison. You can come and go. I have nothing but Alban. Give him back to me. Alban fed me, you know it well. It will only cost you the trouble of saying yes. What can it be to you that there should be in the same room one man called Claude Gueux and another called Alban? For the thing is simply that, Monsieur le Directeur, good Monsieur D, I beseech you earnestly, for heaven's sake." Claude had never before said so much at one time to a jailer. Exhausted with the effort, he paused. The director replied with an impatient gesture, "Impossible. I have said it. Speak to me no more about it. You wear me out." Then, as if in a hurry, he stepped on more quickly, Claude following. Thus speaking, they had reached the door of exit. The prisoners looked after them and listened breathlessly. Claude gently touched the director's arm. "At least let me know why I am condemned to death. Tell me why you have separated him from me." "I have told you," answered the director. "It is my will." He turned his back upon Claude and was about to take hold of the latch of the door. On this answer, Claude had retreated a step. The assembled statues who were there saw him bring out his right hand and the hatchet with it. It was raised, and ere the victim could utter one cry, 3 blows, one upon the other, had cleft his skull. At the moment when he fell back, a 4th blow laid his face open. Then, as if his frenzy, once let loose, could not stop, Claude struck a 5th blow. 'Twas useless. He was dead. "Now for the other," cried the murderer, and threw away the hatchet. That other was himself. They saw him draw from his bosom a small pair of scissors, and before anyone could attempt to hinder him, bury them in his breast. The blade was too short to penetrate. He stuck them in again and again, as many as 20 times. "Accursed heart, cannot I then reach you?" and finally fell in a dead swoon, bathed in blood. Which of these men was the victim of the other? When Claude returned to consciousness, well attended, his wounds carefully bandaged, some good sisters of charity were about his pillow, and more than one magistrate, who asked him, with the appearance of great interest, "Are you better?" He had lost a great quantity of blood, but the scissors with which he had wounded himself had done their duty ill. None of the wounds were dangerous. The examinations commenced. They asked him if it were he who killed the director of the workrooms at Clairvaux. He replied, it was. They asked him why he had done it. He answered, it was his will. After this, the wound festered. He was seized with a severe fever, of which he only did not die. November, December, January, and February went over in recovering him and preparing him for his trial. Physicians and judges alike made him the object of their care. The former healed his wounds, the latter made ready his scaffold. To be brief, on the 10th March, 1832, he appeared, being perfectly cured, before the Assize Court at Troyes. All the inhabitants of the town who could attend were present. Claude made a good appearance before the court. He had been carefully shaved, his head was bare, he was dressed in the sad prison livery of Clairvaux, of 2 shades of gray. The king's advocate had crowded the hall with all the bayonets of the province, to keep in, as he informed the spectators, the wretches who would figure as witnesses in this matter. When the trial was entered upon, a singular difficulty presented itself. Not any of the witnesses of the events of the 4th of November would make a deposition against Claude. The president threatened those with his discretionary power in vain. Claude then commanded them to give evidence. All their tongues were loosed. They related what they had seen. Claude listened with profound attention. When one of them, out of forgetfulness or affection for him, admitted some of the circumstances chargeable upon the accused, Claude supplied them. By this means, the chain of facts which we have related was unfolded before the court. There was one moment when some of the females present wept. The huissier summoned the convict Albon. It was his turn to come forward. He entered, staggering with emotion. He wept. The gendarme could not prevent his falling into the arms of Claude. Claude raised him and said with a smile to the king's advocate, "Here is a villain who shares his bread with those who are hungry." Then he kissed Albon's hand. The list of witnesses have been gone through. The king's advocate rose and spoke in these words: "Gentlemen of the jury, society would be shaken to its foundations if public vengeance did not overtake such great criminals as this man, who, etc., etc." After this memorable discourse, Claude's advocate spoke. The pleader against and the pleader for made each in due order the evaluations which they are accustomed to make in the arena which is called a criminal court. Claude did not think that all was said. He arose in his turn. He spoke in a manner which must have amazed all the intelligent persons present on the occasion. It would appear as if there were more of the orator than the murderer and the poor artisan. He spoke in an upright attitude, with a penetrating and well-managed voice, with an open, sincere, and steadfast gaze, with a gesture almost always the same, but full of command. There were moments in which his genuine, lofty eloquence stirred the crowd to a murmur, during which Claude took breath, casting a bold gaze upon the bystanders. Then again, this man who could not read was as gentle, polished, select in his language as an informed person. At other moments, modest, measured, attentive, going step by step over the irritating parts of the argument, courteous to his judges. Once only he gave way to a burst of passion. The king's advocate had proved in his speech that Claude Gueux had assassinated the director without any violence on his part and consequently without provocation. "What?" exclaimed Claude. "I have not been provoked? Ah, yes, it is the truth. I understand you. A drunken man strikes me with his dagger. I kill him. I have been provoked. You show mercy to me. You send me to the gallows. But a man who is not drunk, who has his perfect reason, wrings my heart for 4 years, humbles me for 4 years, pierces me with a weapon every day, every hour, every minute, in some unexpected point, for 4 years. I had a wife, for whose sake I became a thief. He tortures me through that wife. A child for whom I stole. He tortures me through that child. I have not enough to eat. A friend gives it me. He takes away my friend and my food. I ask for friend back. He condemns me to solitary confinement. I speak to him the spy, respectfully. He answers me in dog's language. I tell him I am suffering. He tells me I wear him out. What would you then that I should do? I kill him. It is well. I am a monster. I have murdered this man. I have not been provoked. You may take my life for it. Be it so. The debates being closed, the president made his impartial and luminous summing up. The results were: a wicked life, a wretch in purpose. Claude Gueux had begun by living in concubinage. He had stolen, then murdered. All this was true. When the jury were about being conducted to their apartment, the president asked the accused if he had anything to say upon the question before them. Little, replied Claude. Only this: I am a thief and assassin. I have stolen and have slain a man. But why have I stolen? Why have I murdered? Add these 2 questions to the rest, gentlemen of the jury. After a quarter of an hour's deliberation on part of the 12 countrymen whom he addressed as gentlemen of the jury, Claude Gueux was condemned to death. It is certain that at the beginning of the cause, many of them had remarked that the accused was called Gueux, or beggar, which had made a profound impression upon them. Their decision was read to Claude, who contented himself with saying, "It is well, but why has this man stolen? Why has this man murdered? These are questions to which they make no answer." He is carried back to prison. He supped almost gaily. He had no wish to make an appeal against his sentence. One of the sisters, who had nursed him, entreated him with tears to do so. He complied out of kindness to her. It would appear as if he had resisted till the very last moment, for when he signed his petition in the register, the legal delay of 3 days had expired some minutes before. The poor, grateful sister gave him 5 francs. He accepted the money and thanked her. While his appeal was pending, offers of escape were made to him by prisoners at Troyes, who were devoted to him. They threw one after another into his dungeon through its air hole a nail, a bit of iron file, and the handle of a bucket. Any of these 3 tools would have been sufficient to so skillful a man as Claude to cut through his irons. He gave up the nail, the file, and the handle to the turnkey. On the 1st of June, 1832, 7 months and 4 days after the deed, its expiration arrived, Paix de Claude, as we see. That day, at 7 o'clock in the morning, the recorder of the tribunal entered Claude's dungeon and announced to him that he had not more than an hour to live. His petition was rejected. "Come," said Claude coldly. "I have this night slept well, without troubling myself that I would sleep better the next." It would appear as if the words of strong men always receive a certain dignity from approaching death. The priest arrived, then the executioner. He was humble to the one and gentle to the other. He maintained a perfect ease of spirit. While they were cutting off his hair, someone spoke in a corner of the dungeon of the cholera, which was at that moment threatening Troyes. "For my part," said Claude, with a smile, "I have no fear of the cholera." He listened to the priest with extreme attention, accusing himself of many things and regretting that he had not been instructed in religion. At his request, they had given him back the scissors with which he had wounded himself. One blade, which had been broken in his breast, was wanting. He entreated the jailer to have these scissors taken to Albon, as from himself. He said also that he was anxious they should add to their legacy the ration of bread he should have eaten that day. He besought those who bound his hands to place in his right hand the 5-franc piece which the sister had given him. At 7:45, he went out of his prison with the customary mournful procession which attends the condemned. He was on foot, pale, his eyes fixed on the priest's crucifix, but he walked with a firm step. This day had been chosen for his execution because it was market day, that he might be beheld on his way to the scaffold by as many as possible, for it would seem that there were yet in France towns full of half-savage people, who, when society takes a man's life, make a public boast of it. He ascended the scaffold gravely, his eyes always fixed on the cross of Christ. He embraced the priest first, then the executioner, thanking the one, forgiving the other. The executioner pushed him back gently, says one account. At the moment when the assistant bound him on the hideous machine, he made a sign to the priest to take the 5-franc piece which he had in his right hand, and said to him, "For the poor." At the moment the clock was striking 8. The sound from the steeple drowned his voice, and the confessor answered that he could not hear him. Claude waited for an interval between 2 of the strokes, and repeated with gentleness, "For the poor." The 8th stroke had not yet sounded when the noble and intelligent head had fallen. End of Section 1. Recording by Aidan Fitzgerald.
Section 2 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 2, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 2, The Ghost, by J.K. Paulding. Sometime in the year 1800 or 1801, I'm not certain which, a man by the name of William Morgan, I don't mean the man whose abduction has made so much noise in the world, enlisted on board the United States frigate for a 3 years' cruise in the Mediterranean. He was an awful-looking person, 6 feet 4 inches high, a long pale visage, deeply furrowed with wrinkles, sunken eyes far up towards his forehead, black exuberant hair standing on end as if he was always frightened at something, a sharp chin of a length proportioned to his height, teeth white but very irregular, and the color of his eyes, what the writers on supernatural affairs call very singular and mysterious. Besides this, his voice was hollow and sepulchral. On his right arm were engraved certain mysterious devices, surmounted with the letters E.M., and his tobacco box was of iron. His everyday dress was a canvas hat with a black ribbon band, a blue jacket, white trousers, and leather shoes. On Sundays he wore a white beaver, which, among sailors, bespoke something extraordinary, and on rainy days a pea-jacket too short by half a yard. It is worthy of remark that Morgan entered on Friday, that the frigate was launched on Friday, that the master carpenter who built her was born on Friday. All these singular coincidences, combined with his mysterious appearance, caused the sailors to look upon Morgan with some little degree of wonder. During the voyage to Gibraltar, Morgan's conduct served to increase the impression his appearance had made on the crew. He sometimes went without eating for several days together, At least no one ever saw him eat, and if he ever slept at all, it was without shutting his eyes or lying down, for his messmates, one and all, swore that, wake at what time of the night they would, Morgan was seen sitting upright in his hammock, with his eyes glaring wide open. When his turn came to take his watch upon deck, his conduct was equally strange. He would stand stock still in one place, gazing at the stars of the ocean, apparently unconscious of his situation, and when roused by his companions, fell flat on the deck in a swoon. When he revived, he would fall to preaching the most strange and incomprehensible rhapsodies that ever were heard. In their idle hours upon the forecastle, Morgan would tell such stories about himself and his strange escapes by sea and by land as caused the sailors' hair to stand on end, and made the jolly fellows look upon him as a person gifted with the privilege of living for ever. He often indeed hinted that he had as many lives as a cat, and more than once offered to let himself be hanged for the gratification of his messmates. On more than one occasion he was found lying on his back in his hammock, apparently without life, his eyes fixed and glowing, his limbs stiff and rigid, his lower jaw sunk down, and his pulse motionless, at least so his messmates swore when they went to call the doctor, though when the latter came, he always found Morgan as well as ever he was in his life, and apparently unconscious of all that had happened. As they proceeded on the voyage, which proved for the most part a succession of calms, the sailors, having little else to do, either imagined or invented new wonders about Morgan. At one time a little Welsh foretopman swore that as he was going to sit down to dinner, his canteen was snatched from under him by an invisible hand, and he fell plump on the deck. A second had his allowance of grog abducted in a mysterious manner, although he was ready to make oath he never had his eyes off it for a moment. A third had his tobacco box rifled, though it had never been out of his pocket. A fourth had a crooked sixpence, with a hole by which it was suspended from his neck by a ribbon, taken away without his ever being the wiser for it. These things at length reached the ears of Captain R., who, the next time Morgan got into one of his trances, had him confined for 24 hours, and otherwise punished him in various ways on the recurrence of any of these wonderful reports. All this produced no effect whatever, either on Morgan or the crew, which at length had its wonder stretched to the utmost bounds by a singular adventure of our hero. One day, the squadron being about halfway across the Atlantic, and the frigate several leagues ahead with a fine breeze, there was an alarm of the magazine being on fire. Morgan was just coming on deck with a spoon in his hand, for some purpose or other, when hearing the cry of magazine on fire, he made one spring overboard. The fire was extinguished by the daring gallantry of an officer, now living and standing in the first rank of our naval heroes. In the confusion and alarm, it was impossible to make any efforts to save Morgan, and it was considered a matter of course that he had perished in the ocean. 2 days after, one of the other vessels of the squadron came alongside of the frigate, and sent a boat on board with Billy Morgan. 12 hours after his leap overboard, he had been found swimming away gallantly with the spoon in his hand. When asked why he did not let it go, he replied that he kept it to help himself to salt water when he was dry. This adventure fixed in the minds of the sailors an obstinate opinion that Morgan was either a dead man come to life again, or one that was not very easily to be killed. After this, Morgan continued his mysterious pranks. The sailors talked and wondered at Captain R., punished him until the squadron were within 2 or 3 days' sail of Gibraltar, admitting the wind continued fair as it then was. Morgan had been punished pretty severely that morning for star-gazing and falling into a swoon on his watch the night before, and had solemnly assured his messmates that he intended to jump overboard and drown himself the first opportunity. He made his will, dressed himself in his best, and settled all his affairs. He also replenished his tobacco box, put his allowance of biscuit in his pocket, and filled a small canteen with water, which he strung about his neck, saying that perhaps he might take it into his head to live a day or two in the water before he finally went to the bottom. Between 12 and 1, the vessel being becalmed, the night a clear starlight, and the sentinels pacing their rounds, Morgan was distinctly seen to come up through the hatchway, walk forward, climb the bulwark, and let himself drop into the sea. A midshipman and 2 seamen testified to the facts, and Morgan being missing the next morning, there was no doubt of his having committed suicide by drowning himself. This affair occasioned much talk, and various were the opinions of the ship's crew on the subject. Some swore it was one Davy Jones who had been playing his pranks, others that it was no man but a ghost or devil that had got among them, and others were in daily expectation of seeing him come on board again as well as ever he was. In the meantime the squadron proceeded but slowly, being detained several days by calms and headwinds, most of which was in some way or other laid to Morgan by the gallant tars, who feared nothing but Fridays and men without heads. His fate, however, gradually ceased to be a subject of discussion, and the wonder was quickly passing away, when one night, about a week after his jumping overboard, the figure of Morgan, all pale and ghastly, his clothes hanging wet about him, with eyes more sunken, hair more upright, and face more thin and cadaverous than ever, was seen by one of his messmates, who happened to be lying awake, to emerge slowly from the forepart of the ship, approach one of the tables where there was a can of water, from which it took a hearty draught, and disappear in the direction whence it came. The sailor told the story next morning, but as yet very few believed him. The next night the same figure appeared, and was seen by a different person from him by whom it was first observed. It came from the same quarter again, helped itself to a drink, and disappeared in the same direction it had done before. The story of Morgan's ghost, in the course of a day or two, came to the ears of Captain R., who caused a search to be made in that part of the vessel whence the ghost had come, under the impression that the jumping overboard of Morgan had been a deception, and that he was now secreted on board the ship. The search ended, however, without any discovery. The calms and headwinds still continued, and not a sailor on board but ascribed them to Billy Morgan's mysterious influence. The ghost made its appearance again the following night after the search, when it was seen by another of Morgan's messmates to empty his tobacco box and seize some of the fragments of supper which had been accidentally left on a table, with which it again vanished in the manner before described. The sailor swore that when the ghost made free with his tobacco box, he attempted to lay hold of him, but felt nothing in his hand but something exactly like cold water. Captain R. was excessively provoked at these stories, and caused another and still more thorough search to be made, but without any discovery. He then directed a young midshipman to keep watch between decks. That night the ghost again made its appearance, and the courageous young officers sallied out upon it, but the figure darted away with inconceivable velocity and disappeared. The midshipman, as directed, immediately informed Captain R., who instituted an immediate search, but with as little success as before. By this time there was not one sailor on board that was not afraid of his shadow, and even the officers began to be infected with a superstitious dread. At length the squadron arrived at Gibraltar, and came to in the bay of Algeciras, where the ships remained some days waiting the arrival of those they had come to relieve. About the usual hour that night the ghost of Billy Morgan again appeared to one of his messmates, offered him its hand, and saying, "Goodbye, Tom," disappeared as usual. It was a fortnight or more before the squadron sailed up the Mediterranean, during which time the crews of the ships were permitted to take their time to go on shore. On one of these occasions a messmate of Billy Morgan, named Tom Brown, was passing through a tolerably dark lane in the suburbs of Algeciras, when he heard a well-known voice call out, "Tom, Tom, darn your eyes, don't you know your old messmate?" Tom knew the voice, and looking round recognized his old messmate Morgan's ghost, but he had no inclination to renew the acquaintance. He took to his heels, and without looking behind him to see if the ghost followed, ran to the boat where his companions were waiting, and told the story as soon as he could find breath for the purpose. This reached the ear of Captain R., who, being almost sure of the existence of Morgan, applied to the governor of the town, who caused search to be made everywhere without effect. No one had ever seen such a person. That very night the ghost made its appearance on board the frigate, and passed its cold wet hand over the face of Tom Brown, to whom Morgan had left his watch and chest of clothes. The poor fellow bawled out lustily, but before any pursuit could be made the ghost had disappeared in the forward part of the ship as usual. After this Billy again appeared 2 or 3 times alternately to some one of his messmates, sometimes in the town, at others on board the frigate, but always in the dead of night. He seemed desirous to say something particular, but could never succeed in getting any of the sailors to listen quietly to the communication. The last time he made his appearance at Algeciras on board the frigate, he was heard by one of the sailors to utter in a low, hollow whisper, "You shall see me at Malta," after which he vanished as before. Captain R. was excessively perplexed at these strange and unaccountable visitations, and instituted every possible inquiry into the circumstances, in the hope of finding some other clue to explain the mystery. He again caused the ship to be examined, with a view to the discovery either of the place where Morgan secreted himself, or the means by which he escaped from the vessel. He questioned every man on board, and threatened the severest punishment should he ever discover that they deceived him in their story, or were accomplices to the escape of Morgan. He even removed everything in the forward part of the ship, and rendered it impossible for any human being to be there without being detected. The whole resulted in leaving the affair in complete mystery, and the squadron proceeded up the Mediterranean to cruise along the African coast and rendezvous at Malta. It was some weeks before the frigate came to the latter place, and in the meantime, as nothing had been seen of the ghost, it was concluded that the shade of Billy Morgan was appeased, or rather the whole affair had been gradually forgotten. 2 nights after her arrival, a party of sailors, being ashore at La Valette, accidentally entered a small tavern in a remote part of the suburbs, where they commenced a frolic after the manner of those amphibious bipeds. Among them was the heir of Billy Morgan, who, about 3 or 4 in the morning, went to bed, not quite so clear-headed as he might have been. He could not tell how long he had been asleep when he was awakened by a voice whispering in his ear, "Tom, Tom, wake up." On opening his eyes, he beheld, by the pale light of the morning, the ghastly figure of Billy Morgan leaning over his bed and glaring at him with eyes like saucers. Tom cried, "Murder! Ghost! Billy Morgan!" as loud as he could bawl, until he roused the landlord, who came to know what was the matter. Tom related the whole affair, and inquired if he had seen anything of the figure he described. Mine host utterly denied having ever seen or ever heard of such a figure as Billy Morgan, and so did all his family. The report was again alive on board the frigate that Billy Morgan's ghost had taken the field again. "Heaven and earth!" cried Captain R. "Is Billy Morgan's ghost come again? Shall I never get rid of this infernal spectre, or whatever else it may be?" Captain R. immediately ordered his barge, waited on the governor, explained the situation of his crew, and begged his assistance in apprehending the ghost of Billy Morgan, or Billy himself, as the case might be. That night the governor caused the strictest search to be made in every hole and corner of the little town of La Valette, but in vain. No one had seen that remarkable being, corporeal or spiritual, and the landlord of the house where the spectre appeared, together with all his family, utterly denied any knowledge of such a person or thing. It is little to be wondered at that the search proved ineffectual, for that very night Billy took a fancy to appear on board the frigate, where he again accosted his old friend Tom, to whom he had bequeathed all his goods and chattels. But Tom had no mind for a confidential communication with the ghost, and roared out lustily, as usual, that it glided away and disappeared as before, without being intercepted in the confusion which followed. Captain R. was in despair. Never was man so persecuted by a ghost in this world before. The ship's crew were in a state of terror and dismay, insomuch that had an Algerine come across them, they might peradventure have surrendered at discretion. They signed a round robin, drawn up by one of Billy Morgan's old messmates, representing to Captain R. the propriety of running the ship ashore and abandoning her entirely to the ghost, which now appeared almost every night, sometimes between decks, at others on the end of the bowsprit, and at others cutting capers on the yards and topgallant masts. The story spread into the town of La Valette, and nothing was talked of but the ghost of Billy Morgan, which now began to appear occasionally to the sentinels of the fort, one of whom had the courage to fire at it, by which he alarmed the whole island, and made matters 10 times worse than ever. From Malta the squadron, after making a cruise of a few weeks, proceeded to Syracuse, with the intention of remaining some time. They were obliged to perform a long quarantine. The ships were strictly examined by the health officers, and fumigated with brimstone, to the great satisfaction of the crew of the frigate, who were in great hopes this would drive away Billy Morgan's ghost. These hopes were strengthened by their seeing no more of that troublesome visitor during the whole time quarantine continued. The very next night after the expiration of the quarantine, Billy again visited his old messmate and heir, Tom Brown, lank, lean, and dripping wet as usual, and after giving him a rousing shake, whispered, "Hush, Tom, I want to speak to you about my watch and chest of clothes." But Tom had no inclination to converse with his old friend, and cried out "Murder!" with all his might, when the ghost vanished as before, muttering, as Tom swore, "You bloody infernal lubber." The reappearance of the ghost occasioned greater consternation than ever among the crew of the good ship, and it required all the influence of severe punishment to keep them from deserting on every occasion. Poor Tom Brown, to whom the devoir of the spectre seemed most especially directed, left off swearing and chewing tobacco, and dwindled to a perfect shadow. He became very serious, and spent almost all his leisure time in reading chapters in the Bible or singing psalms. Captain R. now ordered a constant watch all night between decks in hopes of detecting the intruder, but all in vain, although there was hardly a night passed without Tom waking and crying out that the ghost had just paid him a visit. It was, however, thought very singular, and to afford additional proof of its being a ghost, that on all occasions except two it was invisible to everybody but Tom Brown. In addition to the vexation arising from this persevering and diabolical persecution of Billy's ghost, various other strange and unaccountable things happened almost every day on board the frigate. Tobacco boxes were emptied in the most mysterious manner, and in the dead of the night sailors would sometimes be missing a whole day and return again without being able to give an account of themselves, and not a few of them were overtaken with liquor without their being ever the wiser for it, for they all swore they had not drunk a drop beyond their allowance. Sometimes, on going ashore and leave for a limited time, the sailors would be decoyed, as they solemnly assured the captain, by some unaccountable influence, into strange, out-of-the-way places, where they could not find their road back, and where they were found by their officers in a state of mysterious stupefaction, though not one had tasted a drop of liquor. On these occasions they always saw the ghost of Billy Morgan, either flying through the air or dancing on the tops of the steeples with a fiery tail like a comet. Wonder grew upon wonder every day, until the wonder transcended the bounds of human credulity. At length Tom Brown, the night after receiving a visit from Billy Morgan's ghost, disappeared, and was never heard of afterward. As the chest of clothes inherited from his deceased messmate was found entirely empty, it might have been surmised that Tom had deserted, had not a sailor who was on the watch solemnly declared that he saw the ghost of Billy Morgan jump overboard with him in a flame of fire, and that they hissed like a red-hot plowshare in the water. After this bold feat, the spectre appeared no more. The squadron remained some time at Syracuse, and various adventures befell the officers and crews, which those remaining alive tell to this day. How Macdonough, then a madcap midshipman, licked the high constable of the town, how Burroughs quizzed the governor, what rows they kicked up at masquerades, and what wonders they whispered in the ears of Dionysius. From thence they again sailed on a cruise, and after teaching the Bey of Tripoli a new way of paying tribute, and laying the foundation of that structure of imperishable glory which shall one day reach the highest heaven, returned home after an absence of between 2 and 3 years. The crew of the frigate were paid off and discharged, and it is on record as a wonder that their 3 years' pay lasted some of them nearly 3 days. But though we believe in the ghost of Billy Morgan, we can scarcely credit this incredible wonder. Certain it is that not a man of them ever doubted for a moment the reality of the spectre, or would have hesitated to make oath to having seen it more than once. Even Captain R. spoke of it on his return as one of those strange, inscrutable things which baffle the efforts of human ingenuity, and seem to justify the most extraordinary relations of past and present times. His understanding revolted at the absurdity of a great part of the wonders ascribed to Billy Morgan's ghost, but some of the facts were so well attested that a painful doubt would often pass over his mind, giving him superstitious impressions. He remained in this state of mixed skepticism and credulity when, some years after his return from the Mediterranean, being on a journey to the westward, he had occasion to halt at a log house on the borders of Tennessee for refreshment. A man came forth to receive him, whom he at once recognized as his old acquaintance Billy Morgan. Heavens, thought Captain R., here's Monsieur Tonson come again. Billy, who had also found out who his guest was when too late to retreat, looked rather sheepish, and invited him in with little of the frank hospitality characteristic of a genuine backwoodsman. Captain R. followed him into the house, where he found a comely, good-natured dame, and 2 or 3 yellow-haired boys and girls, all in a fluster at the stranger. The house had an air of comfort, and the mistress, by her stirring activity, accompanied with smiling looks withal, seemed pleased at the rare accident of a stranger entering their door. Billy Morgan was at first rather shy and awkward, but finding Captain R. treated him with good-humoured frankness, he, in the course of the evening, when the children were gone to bed and the wife busy in milking the cows, took occasion to accost his old commander. "Captain, I hope you don't mean to shoot me for a deserter?" "By no means," said the captain, smiling. "There would be little use in shooting a ghost, or a man with as many lives as a cat." Billy Morgan smiled a rather melancholy smile. "Ah, Captain, you have not forgotten the ghost, I see. But it is a long time to remember an old score, and I hope you'll forgive me." "On one condition I will," replied Captain R., "that you tell me honestly how you managed to make all my sailors believe they saw you, night after night, on board the ship as well as on shore." "They did see me," replied Billy in his usual sepulchral voice. The captain again to be in some doubt whether he was talking to Billy Morgan or his ghost. "You don't pretend to say you were really on board my vessel all the time?" "No, not all the time, only at such times as the sailors saw me, except previous to our arrival at Gibraltar." "Then their seeing you jump overboard was all a deception?" "By no means, sir. I did jump overboard, but then I climbed back again directly after." "The deuce you did! Explain." "I will, sir, as well as I am able. I was many years among the Sandwich Islanders, where the vessel in which I was a cabin boy was wrecked a long time ago, and I can pass whole hours, I believe days, in the water, without being fatigued except for want of sleep. I have also got some of their other habits, such as a great dislike to hard work and a liking for going where I will and doing just what I please. The discipline of a man of war did not suit me at all, and I grew tired after a few days. To pass the time and to make fun for myself with the sailors, I told them stories of my adventures and pretended that I could live in the water and had as many lives as a cat. Besides this, as you know, I played them many other pranks, partly from amusement and partly from a kind of pride I felt in making them believe I was half a wizard. The punishment you gave me, though I own I deserved it, put me out of all patience, and I made up my mind to desert the very first opportunity. I had an old shipmate with me whom I could trust, and we planned the whole thing together. I knew if I deserted at Gibraltar or any of the ports of the Mediterranean, I should almost certainly be caught and shot as an example, and for this purpose we settled that I should jump overboard, return again, and hide myself in a coil of cable which was stowed away between decks, close to the bows, where it was dark even in the daytime. My messmate procured a piece of old canvas with which I might cover myself, if necessary, to make my jumping overboard have a greater effect upon the crew, and to provide against accidents until the ship arrived at Gibraltar. I took care to fill my tobacco box with tobacco, my pockets with biscuits, and to sling a canteen of water round my neck, as I told them perhaps I might take it into my head to go to the bottom for 2 or 3 days. I got Tom Brown to write my will, intending to leave my watch and chest to my messmate, who was to return them to me at Gibraltar the first chance he could get. But Tom played us a trick and put his own name in the place of my friend's. Neither he nor I were any great scholars, and the trick was not found out until afterward, when my friend was afraid of discovery if he made any rout about the matter. "Who was your friend?" asked Captain R. "He is still alive and in the service. I'd rather not mention his name." "Very well," replied Captain R. "Go on." "That night I jumped overboard." "How did you get back into the ship?" asked the captain hastily. "Why, sir, the forward porthole on the starboard side was left open with a bit of rope fastened to the gun and hanging down so that I could catch it. As soon as I had jumped overboard, I swam to the rope, which I held fast, waiting the signal from my friend to climb up and hide myself in the coil of cable. In the bustle which followed, it was easy enough to do this, and nobody saw me but my friend. Here I remained in my wet clothes rather uncomfortably, as you may suppose, until my provision and water were expended and my tobacco box empty. I calculated they would last till we arrived at Gibraltar, when nothing would have been easier for me than to jump out of the porthole and swim ashore. But the plaguy head winds and calms, which I dare say you remember, delayed the squadron several days longer than I expected, and left me without supply. I could have gone without biscuit and water, but it was impossible to live without tobacco. My friend promised to come near enough to hear signals of distress sometimes, but as he told me afterward, he was confined several days for picking a quarrel with Tom Brown, whom he longed to flog for forging the will. I remained in this state until I was nearly starved, when, not being able to stand it any longer, I one night, when everybody between decks seemed fast asleep, crept out from my hiding place, where I was coiled up in the shape of a cable, and finding a pitcher of water, took a hearty drink out of it. This was as far as I dared go at that time, so I went back again as quietly as possible, but I was too hungry to remain quiet, though among the Sandwich Islanders I had been used to go without eating for days at a time. The next night I crept out again, and was lucky enough to get a pretty good supply of provisions, which happened to be left by some accident in the way. 2 or 3 times I heard search making for me, and was very much frightened lest I should be found out in my hole. When we arrived at the Bay of Algeciras, I took an opportunity to frighten Tom Brown a little, by visiting him in the night and bidding him good-bye, after which I slipped quietly out of the porthole and swam ashore, while my friend pulled up the rope and shut the port after me. But how did you manage to escape from the search made by the police of Algeciras? Oh, sir, I was on board the frigate all the time in my old hiding place, and when the ship was searched directly after, I was ashore at that time. And how did you manage at Malta? The landlord was my sworn brother, and would not have blabbed for £1,000. And the capers on the yard arm and top gallant, the visits paid to Tom Brown at Syracuse, and the wonderful stories told by the sailors of being robbed of their tobacco, getting tipsy upon nothing, and being led astray by nobody. What do you say to all that, Mr. Ghost? Said the captain, smiling. I never paid but 2 visits to the ship, so far as I remember, sir, after she left Malta. One was the night I wanted to talk to Tom Brown, the other when he disappeared the night afterward. The rest of the stories were all owing to the jokes of some of the sailors and the fears of the others. But are you sure you did not jump into the sea with Tom Brown in a flame of fire? Yes, sir, as I am an honest man. Tom got away without any help of mine, and without my ever knowing how, until a long time afterward, when I accidentally met him at Liverpool. Well, he was not to be convinced I was living, but ran away as hard as he could, and to this day believes in ghosts as much as he does in being alive himself. So far all is clear enough, said Captain R. But what could possibly induce you to put yourself in the way of being caught after escaping by visiting the ship and letting yourself be seen? I wanted to see Tom Brown, sir. Why so? I wanted to get back my watch and clothes from him. Oh, I see it now. But had you no other object? Why, I'll tell you, sir. Besides that, I had a sort of foolish pride all my life in frightening people and making them wonder at me by telling tough stories or doing strange things. I haven't got over it to this day, and have been well beaten 2 or 3 times, besides being put in a jail for playing the ghost hereabouts with the country people at court time. I confess, too, sir, that I have once or twice frightened my wife almost into fits by way of a frolic, and for all the trouble it has brought upon me, I believe in my soul I shall play the ghost till I give up the ghost at last. Besides this, the truth is, sir, I had a little spite at you for having put me in the bilboes for some of these pranks, as I deserved, and had no objection to pay you off by breeding trouble in the ship. Truly, you succeeded wonderfully, but what became of you afterward? Why, sir, after Tom Brown deserted, and to quiet his conscience, left my watch and clothes to my friend, I had no motive for playing the ghost any more. I shipped in an American merchantman for Smyrna. From thence I went to Gibraltar, and after voyaging a year or 2, and having a few $100, came to Boston at last. I did not dare to stay along shore for fear of being known by some of the officers of the squadron, so I took my money and my bundle and went into the back country. I am a little of everything, a jack of all trades, and turned farmer, as sea captains often do when they are tired of ploughing the ocean. I get on pretty well now, and hope you won't have me shot by a court-martial. No, replied Captain R. I'm out of the navy now. I've turned farmer too, and you are quite safe. I hope you prosper well, sir. Not quite so well as you, Billy. I've come into the backwoods to see if I can do better. Only serve under me, said Billy, and I will repay all your good offices. What, the floggings, etc.? By God's help, sir, I may, said Billy. Try me, sir. No, I'm going a little further. You may go further, and fare worse, sir. Perhaps so, but I believe it is bedtime, and so good night, Mr. Ghost. The captain retired, and was so full of the adventures of Billy Morgan he could not sleep, though he had ridden 40 miles that day on horseback. It might be about 2 hours before daylight when he thought he heard a sort of low whispering under his window, which was on the ground floor, and all at once the loneliness of his situation came across his mind. If ever there was a man that looked suspicious, it was Billy Morgan, and if ever there was a spot where a traveller might be dispatched with impunity, it was this lonely retreat in the almost pathless forest. A thought also came across him that he had told Billy that he was come with a view to the purchase of land, and of course he must have money. At all events, no man could set out on journey of some thousands of miles without a few $100 to bear his expenses. Captain R. was a man of great resolution, but there are times and situations in which the apprehension of danger is 1,000 times more appalling than the reality. Indeed, we are persuaded from our own experience that imagination makes more cowards than all other causes put together. The captain tried to reason and then to bully these apprehensions into silence, but the whisperings continued, and at length he could distinguish the low, hollow voice of Billy Morgan saying, "Hush, you'll wake the captain." "Shall I shoot him now?" replied someone in the same suppressed tone. "No," replied Billy, "you can't see him quite plain enough yet. You may miss him." "Well, if I do, you can try him afterward. He'll run away." "I'll be darned if I do," thought Captain R., cautiously raising himself up in bed, and peeping out at the window which was just at his bedside. There was no moon, and the whole expanse of the heavens was veiled by light fleecy clouds, which entirely hid the stars, and caused an indistinct obscurity, through which objects could be perceived in the outline, but not in their distinct features. Crouching in a large plane tree, whose hollow trunk would have accommodated a troop of robbers, he distinguished 2 figures, cowering and stooping, as if to see some object in the distance. There he is," whispered one. "Fire." "Darn it," said Billy in his low, deep tones, "he's dodged us this time. Look out again, and the very first glimpse you get of his eyes, fire away." Captain R. rose, dressed as briefly as possible, and arming himself with a pair of pistols he had brought with him, seated himself near the only door of his room, in a situation where he could not be seen without calmly awaiting the result. The more the appearance of danger assumed the part of reality, the more his courage rose to meet it. He had not sat thus for 5 minutes when he heard the 2 rifles fired in quick succession. A moment later the voice of Billy Morgan was distinguished. "We've done for the gentleman." "Not quite," thought Captain R., cocking his pistol and expecting a visit every moment. "I saw him drop," cried Billy's companion. "He has run away," answered Billy. "You lie, you scoundrel," muttered Captain R., in a violent passion, and sallying forth as he exclaimed, I'll show you whether I've run away." He advanced boldly towards the two villains, who were now groping about among the neighbouring bushes. At last one of them cried, "Oh, here's the gentleman, as dead as Julius Caesar. He'll never tell who did it, I reckon." "He's as fat as butter," said Billy. "It's not me, after all," thought Captain R., "that they intended to murder, some poor unfortunate fat gentleman who has lost his way in these woods. Rascals," cried he, rushing forward, "whom have you been murdering here?" "Only a bear, sir," cried the ghost of Billy Morgan. "He's been robbing my pig pen for some time past, but I think I've paid off all old scores now." Captain R. returned quietly to his room, went to bed, and slept like a top till the broad sun shone over the summits of the trees into his face as he lay under the window. He breakfasted sumptuously upon a steak of the fat gentleman, and set out gallantly for the prairies of St. Louis. "Good bye, Captain," said Billy, leering and lengthening his face to a supernatural degree. "I hope you won't be murdered on your way." "Good bye, Billy," replied Captain R., a little nettled. "I hope you will not get into the state prison for playing the ghost." "I'll take care of that, sir. I've been in the state prison 3 years already, and you won't catch me there again, I warrant you." "What do you mean, Billy?" "I mean that there's little or no odds between stateship and state prison," said Billy, with a face longer than ever, and most expressive shrug. Captain R. proceeded on his way, reflecting on the singular story of Billy Morgan, whose pranks on board the frigate had convinced some hundreds of men of the existence of ghosts, and thrown the gloom of superstitious horror over the remainder of their existence. Not a sailor, thought he, out of more than 500, with the exception of a single one, but will go to his grave in the full belief in the appearance of Billy Morgan's ghost. What an unlucky rencontre this of mine! It has spoiled one of the most authenticated ghost stories of the age. End of section 2. Section 3 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 2, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 3. The Widower, by Thomas Haynes Bailey. Were I, Damon Daffodil, to announce my intention of writing the memoirs of my bachelor days, the reading public would be on the tiptoe of expectation, eager to trace the flirtations of un joli garçon, while half the pretty women would be on their exquisite marrow bones, entreating to be omitted in the long list of my conquests. But I am no traitor to the fair, or as it is very justly called, the weaker sex. True it is that I have detailed the happy hours of my unmarried life, not in black and white, but on pink paper with blue ink. But the manuscript is carefully folded, sealed, and tied with white satin riband, and it is not to be made public for a century at least. I therefore skip my many hairbreadth scapes, and proceed at once to the day when I so far committed myself as to stand irrevocably on the brink of matrimony. My chosen was not so pretty as I could have wished, being tall, thin, and angular, nor did she turn out so amiable as I had thought her, being vain, opinionative, and dictatorial. But at the period of which I speak, everything was couleur de rose, so much so indeed that I never detected she was a blue. We married, and as my wedding day was one of weeping to many fair damsels, who shall at present be nameless, I of course anticipated perpetual smiles and sunshine on the part of Mrs. Daffodil, but Mrs. D.'s serenity only lasted just so long as she was the one person thought of, looked at, and attended to in society. And not being exactly the fairest of the fair, nor the brightest of the bright, there were moments when others, and when it must be owned, I myself, ventured to praise other beauties, and to listen to the silver accents of other lips. Then it was that Rebecca Daffodil would boil with indignation, and talk at others, and praise herself, until I began to wish that some more deserving individual had properly appreciated her, and snatched her from the offer which I had rather precipitately made. As is the custom in all civilized societies, her portrait was to be painted, and nominally presented to her husband, that is to say, I was to pay for it, and then I was to see less of it than anybody else, for it was to be sent to the exhibition, and then to be hung up, not in my own room, for nobody would have seen it there, but in the drawing-room. I pitied the poor artist from my soul. He began, and indeed very nearly finished, a very admirable likeness, but in an unlucky hour he permitted Rebecca to peep at his performance. I never shall forget her that day as long as I live. "Have you seen my portrait, love?" said she to me at dinner. "Yes, dear." "And what do you think of it?" cried she. "Admirable. I never saw a better likeness." "You are jesting." "No, indeed," I replied. "As I said to Mr. Tintums, it really was like looking at yourself." "He told me you said so, but I could not believe it until I heard it from your own lips. Why, I showed it to 15 highly talented people this very day, and they said it was abominable, having first been told by you that you did not relish its being thought like." "Nonsense, sir. Look at the lines. It makes me 40 at least." "Well, Becky dear, but you know you are 37. Hold your tongue, Mr. Daffodil. I'm aware that I'm married, an old bachelor, 50, but humph! To the point, my dear. Your picture. Well, it's condemned. St. Aubyn said to-day that he could not blame Mr. Tintums, for that I ought to be painted in rainbow tints." "Oh, ah, that accounts for it." "And though raven hair and dark eyes may be painted, it is not easy to give the hyacinthine gloss to the one, nor the emanation of the poetic mind to the other." "Yes, yes, I see. In fact, it is not possible to give to my portrait the delicacy and beauty of the original." "Clearly. Money thrown away, then," said I. "Still, you know," added my wife, "that bright circle of which I am the brilliant centre expect to see me on canvas, and the attempt must be made." "It has been made. He must try again. Had my poor mother been alive, this might have passed for her." I said no more, and Rebecca, like an old hen, went on sitting and sitting, until an oval production was exhibited to the public, as like her as it was like me. An oval frame was then procured, and the picture was suspended. I suspended my judgment, because, thinking it young and beautiful, I could not conscientiously say it resembled Becky, but my wife's literary friends all found out some defect, some eye, nose, mouth, or chin, not good enough for the corresponding feature in her face, and lovely as they all declared it to be, they unanimously said, or insinuated, that it was less lovely than the original. In the spring of 1820, Becky and I agreed to travel. We had resolved to visit Guernsey and Jersey, and then to proceed to St. Malo, or some other port on the coast of France. We embarked in a large and commodious steam packet, having engaged a small private cabin, and away we went from the Tower Stairs, full of eager hopes and anticipations, as long as we were in calm water in the river, but all qualms and wretchedness as soon as the motion of the vessel indicated that we were off the North Foreland. We paddled on, however, whether we liked it or not, and got within sight of Dover, when contrary winds, that terrified even our captain, obliged us to put back and anchor in the Downs. Oh, the misery of the day that we spent, rocking and rolling, and pitching to and fro, without advancing 1 inch on our voyage. I was very ill myself, and as for Becky, I really thought she would have died, but she didn't, at least not then. Our cabin was a mere cell, and the misery of it, during the time that we were anchorites, is not to be described. But somehow poor Becky and I never agreed so well in our lives. By being both seasick to a humiliating extent, we were connected by a reciprocity of feeling that had never existed before. In the pauses of our indisposition, we looked wistfully at one another, and sympathy was kindled in our bosoms. Besides, there is nothing like habit. It reconciles us to anything and anybody. And wretched as I was in the little cupboard where we were immured, I felt that I should have been more wretched had I been deprived of the society of my wife and her little dog Snap. Snap was as seasick as ourselves, and never shall I forget Becky's answer when a rough sailor said, "How your dog be cadding, marm?" I think there was a contradiction in the phrase. It is truly said that after a storm comes a calm, and so it did, but then again after the calm came another storm, and so we went on, and we were blown hither and thither until our paddles were broken, our coals exhausted, and our provisions as low as our spirits. Not that I and Becky cared about provisions, but the crew did, and while the captain and mate walked the deck and consulted what was best to be done, I and my mate watched them in silence, like unhappy criminals, expecting every moment to hear sentence of death pronounced upon them. Our vessel had been christened the Duck, but so battered and forlorn was her condition that I could not help asking myself the old question, can a duck swim? I confess I began to have my misgivings. The sea was rough, the clouds were dark, and our captain evidently did not know exactly where we were. By no means a cheering situation. But, worn out with watching, weariness, and want of food, Becky and I undressed ourselves and retired to a very little bed, which was spread upon a sort of shelf in our cabin. I am morally convinced it never could have been intended to accommodate two, but in such an hour we were not to be separated, and we both soon fell asleep. All of a sudden the ship struck upon something with a concussion so violent that I, who had placed myself on the outer extremity of the shelf, was thrown out of bed upon the floor of the cabin. Becky, I believe, slept on. I cannot say positively. I'm not sure, for in the hurry of the moment, without thinking of her, poor thing, I snatched with my right hand a box containing all my valuables, and seizing my small clothes with my left, I rushed upon deck in a state of nudity and anxiety to see what was the matter, and I found that our vessel, the Duck, had run foul of another vessel and was filling fast and going to the bottom. The two vessels became entangled for a minute or two, and it was just possible to step from the smaller one into the bigger and the safer. I instantly took the step, and found myself standing on the deck of a strange vessel, surrounded by gentlemen and ladies I had never seen before, and I just as I had left my pillow with my box in one hand and my small clothes in the other. I rushed to a secluded corner to put on the latter, and then paid my respects to the captain, politely requesting him to accommodate Mrs. Daffodil as well as myself. It was a dreadful moment for a husband. There are tragedies in real life, too painful to be detailed in a narrative, too heartrending to be represented on the stage. Such was mine. The captain congratulated me on my own escape, but as for my beloved wife, and the Duck that bore her, of which in the darkness he had obtained but a glimpse, it appeared to be the general opinion that she was a wreck and gone to the bottom. What a horrid phrase for a husband to hear! I believe I fainted, and continued for many hours in a state of insensibility. The next day I went on deck, and eagerly looked around for the Duck, nay, for a fragment of that vessel, a hen coop, with Becky astride upon it, waving her nightcap to attract attention. But no, I saw nothing but what people call the waste of waters illuminated by the rising sun. I was yielding sadly to the combined effects of grief and seasickness when it occurred to me to inquire in what I was sailing, and whither we were going. The ship was the Hope, bound for the East Indies. The East Indies? Impossible. I assured Captain Higgins that I could not think of accompanying him, but he smiled and inquired whether a voyage with him was not preferable to being drowned. I will not dwell on my sensations and sufferings. For months I walked the deck, looking on Becky's winding sheet, a sheet of water, or peeping over the side of the vessel into the depths below, at the horrible water wagtails which had perhaps devoured her. It was so awkward to be made extemporaneously a widower. No funeral, no tombstone, no body buried anywhere. For as to what people call a watery grave, it amounts to my thinking to no grave at all, and then the sea has such an awkward way of throwing it up again, one can never feel quite sure. Poor Becky, I pictured to myself, no coffin, and not a rag of a shroud, stretched upon an oyster bed, where at least there was no want of a shell. All this was very shocking. She was, as one of the sailors unfeelingly observed in my hearing, food for fishes, and it was a very long time before I could reconcile myself to the flavour of soles or turbot. I even loathed lobsters, I who used to be so partial to them. Another thing that vexed me was the impossibility of paying proper respect to the defunct and wearing mourning. Becky had all the weeds to herself, seaweeds, alas. And I walked about in a borrowed blue jacket and duck trousers, my only mourning for the duck and her precious passenger. My voyage continued unprosperous. What could be expected after such a beginning? And it was 2 months beyond the usual time allotted for a voyage that I landed at Madras. Oh, that landing! Shall I ever forget it? In such a boat, and amid such a surf, every moment I expected to be reunited to my Becky, but my better angel presided, and I was snatched from the danger that impended. I am not going to dwell upon the events which occurred in the East, nor my motives for remaining there much longer than I intended. I was now a single man. No ties united me to my native country. I amused myself very agreeably, and 2 years had elapsed before I revisited the land of my fathers. My voyage home was pleasant enough. There was a nice lady on board, and a dear, dark, interesting girl, her daughter. We became intimate, and suffice it to say that when we landed I was all but a happy man. We went to the same hotel, and the very next night, before I had communicated with my man of business, or made known my arrival to my friends, I accompanied my fair friends to Drury Lane Theatre, where a young lady was to make her first appearance, Belvidera. We occupied a private box, and engrossed by the interest of the scene, and with my right hand locked in that of the beautiful Anna Maria, I gave myself up to enjoyment, and almost forgot that there was any one else in the house except our 3 selves. Toward the end of the 5th act, however, there resounded a shrill scream from an opposite box, and raising my eyes, I saw— Was it possible? No, it could not be. Yet it was. It was Becky, gazing wildly at me, and resting on the shoulder of an exceedingly tall, dark-whiskered gentleman. I screamed too, and then Becky screamed again, and the debutante on the stage, encouraged by her apparent success, screamed also. Falling on her knees and scratching away at the boards with her nails to dig up Jaffer, but without any digging on my part, and without the aid of any scratch, unless it was the old one, there stood Becky alive before me, and to end so horrible an uncertainty, I ran round the house and entered her private box. It was Becky, and by her side was the Irish gentleman, Captain O'Diddle, of Kilballycurmudgeon Castle, in the County Clare, who was to be united to my wealthy widow on the following Monday. I was sorry for him, very sorry, and for myself more sorry, and for Anna Maria and her mother, and Becky too. It was unpleasant for all parties. However, my late wife and I were soon established in our old residence, and she once more became the brilliant centre of a bright circle. The Duck, though very much damaged, had kept afloat until her crew and passengers were rescued by a steamer on her way to Dublin. Becky, supposing I'd fallen overboard, mourned a decent time in that capital, and then went to Killarney and the Giant's Causeway and other celebrated places in the Emerald Isle, and made the acquaintance of Captain O'Diddle. She never recovered the shock, which shock it is impossible for me to say, my loss or my sudden reappearance. At the end of 2 years she grew nervous, and having no particular complaint, she employed a new popular doctor who cured every imaginable disease after a fashion of his own. Mrs. Daffodil died. I never felt so awkward in my life. I'd gone through all the grief which was to be expected on such an occasion already, and could not do it all over again. Besides, months ago I'd made up my mind to her loss. I, however, went into the deepest mourning, for that was still due to her, and I attended the funeral, so that now there can be no mistake, and I am justified in positively stating that the remains of Mrs. Daffodil are deposited in churchyard, beneath a very handsome, large, and weighty monument, which has been erected to her memory by her disconsolate husband. End of section 3.
Section 4 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Manolakes. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 2, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 4, The First and Last Dinner by Professor Wilson. 12 friends, much about the same age, and fixed by their pursuits, their family connections, and other local interests, as permanent inhabitants of the metropolis, agreed one day while they were drinking their wine at the Star and Garter at Richmond, to institute an annual dinner among themselves under the following regulations: that they should dine alternately at each other's houses on the first and last day of the year, that the first bottle of wine uncorked at the first dinner should be recorked and put away to be drank by him who should be the last of their number, that they should never admit a new member, that when one died, 11 should meet, and so on, and that when only one remained, he should on those 2 days dine by himself, and set the usual hours at his solitary table, but the first time he so dined alone, lest it should be the only one, he should then uncork the first bottle, and in the first glass drink to the memory of all who were gone. There was something original and whimsical in the idea, and it was eagerly embraced. They were all in the prime of life, closely attached by reciprocal friendship, fond of social enjoyments, and looked forward to their future meetings with unalloyed anticipations of pleasure. The only thought, indeed, that darkened these anticipations was one not very likely to intrude itself at this moment, that of the hapless wight who was destined to uncork the first bottle to his lonely repast. It was bright summer when this frolic compact was entered into. As their pleasure boat skimmed along the bosom of the Thames on their return to London, they talked of nothing but their first and last feasts of the ensuing years. Their imaginations ran riot with 1,000 gay predictions of festive merriment. They wanted in conjectures of what changes time would operate, joked each other upon their appearance when they should meet, some of them hobbling upon crutches after a severe fit of the gout, others poking about with purblind eyes, whom even spectacles could hardly enable to distinguish the alderman's walk in a haunch of venison, some with portly round bellies and tidy little brown wigs, and others decently dressed out in a new suit of mourning, for the death of a great-granddaughter or a great-grandson. "As for you, George," exclaimed one of the 12, addressing his brother-in-law, "I expect I shall see you as dry, withered, and shrunken as an old eel-skin, you mere outside of a man." And he accompanied the words with a hearty slap on the shoulder. George Fortescue was leaning carelessly over the side of the yacht, laughing the loudest of any at the conversation which had been carried on. The sudden manual salutation of his brother-in-law threw him off his balance, and in a moment he was overboard. They heard the heavy splash of his fall. The boat was proceeding swiftly along, but it was instantly stopped. The utmost consternation now prevailed. It was nearly dark, but Fortescue was known to be an excellent swimmer, and startling as the accident was, they felt certain he would regain the vessel. They could not see him. They listened and heard the sound of his hands and feet. They hailed him, and no answer was returned but in a faint and gurgling voice, and the exclamation, "Oh God!" struck upon their ears. In an instant, 2 or 3 who were expert swimmers plunged into the river and swam to the spot whence the exclamations had proceeded. One of them was within an arm's length of Fortescue. He was struggling and buffeting the water, and before he could be reached, he went down, and his distracted friend beheld the eddying circles of the wave just over the spot where he had sunk. He dived after him and touched the bottom, but the tide must have drifted the body onward, for it could not be found. They proceeded to one of the nearest stations where drags were kept, and having procured the necessary apparatus, they returned to the fatal spot. After the lapse of above an hour, they succeeded in finding the lifeless body of their lost friend. All the usual remedies were employed for restoring suspended animation, but in vain, and they now pursued the remainder of their course to London, in mournful silence, with the corpse of him who had commenced the day of pleasure with them in the fullness of health, of spirits, and of life. Amid their severe grief, they could not but remember that one of the joyous 12 had already slipped out of the little festive circle. The months rolled on, and cold December came with its cheering round of kindly greeting and merry hospitality, and with it came a softened recollection of the fate of poor Fortescue. 11 of the 12 assembled on the last day of the year, and it was impossible not to see their loss as they sat down to dinner. The very irregularity of the table, 6 on one side and only 5 on the other, forced the melancholy event upon their memory. There are few sorrows so stubborn as to resist the united influence of wine, a circle of select friends, and a prospective gaiety. A decorous sigh or two, a few becoming ejaculations, and an instructive observation on the uncertainty of life made up the sum of tender posthumous offerings to the remains of poor George Fortescue, as they proceeded to discharge the most important duties for which they had met. By the time the third glass of champagne had gone round, in addition to sundry potations of fine old hock and capital Madeira, they had ceased to discover anything so very pathetic in the inequality of the two sides of the table, or so melancholy in their crippled number of 11. The rest of the evening passed off very pleasantly in conversation, good-humored enjoyment, and conviviality, and it was not till toward 12 o'clock that poor George Fortescue was again remembered. They all agreed at parting, however, that they had never passed such a happy day, congratulated each other upon having instituted so delightful a meeting, and promised to be punctual to their appointment the ensuing evening, when they were to celebrate the New Year, whose entrance they had welcomed in bumpers of claret, as the watchman bawled "past 12 o'clock" beneath their window. They met accordingly, and their gaiety was without an alloy or drawback. It was only the first time of their assembling after the death of poor George Fortescue that made the recollection of it painful, for though but a few hours had intervened, they now took their seats at the table as if 11 had been their usual number, and as if all were there who had ever expected to be there. It is thus in everything. The first time a man enters a prison, the first book an author writes, the first painting an artist executes, the first battle a general wins, nay, the first time a rogue is hanged, for a rotten rope may provide a second performance even of that ceremony, with all its singleness of character, differ inconceivably from the first repetition. There is a charm, a spell, a novelty, a freshness, a delight, inseparable from the first experience, hanging always excepted, be it remembered, which no art or circumstance can impart to the second. And it is the same in all the darker traits of life. There is a degree of poignancy and anguish in the first assaults of sorrow, which is never found afterward. In every case, it is simply that the first fine edge of our feelings has been taken off, and that it can never be restored. Several years had elapsed, and our 11 friends kept up their anniversaries, as it might aptly enough be called, with scarcely any perceptible change. But alas, there came one dinner at last, darkened by a calamity they never expected to witness, for on that very day their friend, companion, brother almost, was hanged. Yes, Stephen Rowland, the wit, the oracle, the life of their little circle, on the morning of that day forfeited his life upon a public scaffold for having made one single stroke of his pen in a wrong place. In other words, a bill of exchange was passed into his hands for £700, passed out of his hands for £1,700, he having drawn the important little prefix to the hundreds, and the bill being paid at the banker's without examining the words of it. The forgery was discovered, brought home to Roland, and though the greatest interest was used to obtain a remission of the fatal penalty, poor Stephen Roland was hanged. Everybody pitied him, and nobody could tell why he did it. He was not poor, he was not a gambler, he was not a speculator, but phrenology settled it. The organ of acquisitiveness was discovered on his head, after his execution, as large as a pigeon's egg. He could not help it. It would be injustice to the 10 to say that even wine, friendship, and a merry season could dispel the gloom which pervaded this dinner. It was agreed beforehand that they should not allude to the distressing and melancholy theme, and having thus interdicted the only thing which really occupied all their thoughts, the natural consequence was that silent contemplation took the place of dismal discourse, and they separated long before midnight. Some 15 years had now glided away since the fate of poor Roland, and the 10 remained, but the stealing hand of time had written sundry changes in the most legible characters. Raven locks had now become grizzled. 2 or 3 heads with not as many locks altogether as may be reckoned in a walk of half a mile along the Regent's Canal. One was actually covered with a brown wig. The crow's feet were visible in the corner of the eye. Good old port and warm Madeira carried it against hock, claret, red Burgundy, and champagne. Stews, hashes, and ragoûts grew into favor. Crusts were rarely called for to relish cheese after dinner. Conversation was less boisterous, and it turned chiefly to politics and the state of the funds, or the value of landed property. Apologies were made for coming in thick shoes and warm stockings. The doors and windows were more carefully provided with list and sandbags, the fire more in request, and a quiet game of whist filled up the hours that were wont to be devoted to drinking, singing, and riotous merriment. 2 rubbers, a cup of coffee, and at home by 11 o'clock was the usual cry, when the 5th or 6th glass had gone round after the removal of the cloth. At parting, too, there was a long ceremony in the hall, buttoning up great coats, tying on woolen comforters, fixing silk handkerchiefs over the mouth and up to the ears, and grasping sturdy walking canes to support unsteady feet. Their 50th anniversary came, and death had indeed been busy. One had been killed by the overturning of the mail, in which he had taken his place in order to be present at the dinner, having purchased an estate in Monmouthshire and retired thither with his family. Another had undergone the terrific operation for the stone and expired beneath the knife. A third had yielded up a broken spirit 2 years after the loss of an only surviving and beloved daughter. A 4th was carried off in a few days by the cholera morbus. A 5th had breathed his last the very morning he had obtained judgment in his favor by the Lord Chancellor, which had cost him his last shilling nearly to get, and which, after a litigation of 18 years, declared him the rightful possessor of 10,000 a year. 10 minutes after, he was no more. A 6th had perished by the hands of a midnight assassin, who broke into his house for plunder, and sacrificed the owner of it as he grasped convulsively a bundle of exchequer bills, which the robber was drawing from beneath his pillow, where he knew they were every night placed for better security. 4 little old men of withered appearance and decrepit walk, with cracked voices and dim, rayless eyes, sat down, by the mercy of heaven, as they themselves tremulously declared, to celebrate, for the 50th time, the first day of the year, to observe the frolic compact, which half a century before they had entered into at the Star and Garter at Richmond. 8 were in their graves. Yet they chirped cheerily over their glass, though they could scarcely carry it to their lips if it was half full, and cracked their jokes and articulated their words with difficulty, and heard each other with still greater difficulty. They mumbled, they chattered, they laughed, if a sort of strangled wheezing might be called a laugh, and when the wine sent their icy blood in warmer pulse through their veins, they talked of the past as if it were but a yesterday had passed by them, and the future as if it were a busy century that lay before them. They were just the number for a quiet rubber of whist, and for 3 successive years they sat down to one. The 4th came, and their rubber was played with an open dummy. A 5th, and while whist was no longer practicable, 2 could play only at cribbage, and cribbage was the game. but it was little more than the mockery of play. Their palsied hands could hardly hold, or their fading sight distinguish the cards, while their torpid faculties made them doze between each deal. At length came the last dinner, and the survivor of the 12, upon whose head 80 winters had showered their snow, ate his solitary meal. It so chanced that it was in his house and at his table they had celebrated the first. In his cellar, too, had remained, for 58 years, the bottle they had then uncorked, recorked, and which he was that day to uncork again. It stood beside him. With a feeble and reluctant grasp, he took the frail memorial of a youthful vow, and for a moment memory was faithful to her office. She threw open the long vista of years, and his heart traveled through them all, their lusty and blithesome spring, their bright and fervid summer, their ripe and temperate autumn, their chill but not too frozen winter. He saw, as in a mirror, how, one by one, the laughing companions of that merry hour at Richmond had dropped into eternity. He felt all the loneliness of his condition, for he had eschewed marriage, and in the veins of no living creature ran a drop of blood whose source was in his own. And as he drained the glass which he had filled, to the memory of those who were gone, the tears slowly trickled down the deep furrows of his aged face. He had thus fulfilled one part of his vow, and he prepared himself to discharge the other by sitting the usual number of hours at his desolate table. With a heavy heart he resigned himself to the gloom of his own thoughts. A lethargic sleep stole over him. His head fell upon his bosom. Confused images crowded into his mind. He babbled to himself, was silent, and when his servant entered the room, alarmed by a noise which he heard, he found his master stretched upon the carpet at the foot of the easy-chair, out of which he had slipped in an apoplectic fit. He never spoke again, nor once opened his eyes, although the vital spark was not extinct until the following day, and this was his last day. End of section 4.
Section 5 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 2, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 5. The World as It Is. What a delightful thing the world is! Lady Lennox's ball last night, how charming it was, everyone so kind, and Charlotte looking so pretty, the nicest girl I ever saw. But I must dress now. Balfour is to be here at 12 with a horse he wants to sell me. How lucky I am to have such a friend as Balfour, so entertaining, so good-natured, so devilish clever, too, and such an excellent heart. Ah, how unlucky! It rains a little, but never mind, it will clear up, and if it don't, why, there's billiards. What a delightful thing the world is! So soliloquized Charles Nugent, a man of 21, a philanthropist, an optimist. Our young gentleman was an orphan, of good family and large fortune. Brave, generous, confiding, and open-hearted, his ability was above the ordinary standard, and he had a warm love and a pure taste for letters. He had even bent a knee to philosophy, but the calm and cold graces with which the goddess receives her servants had soon discontented the young votary with the worship. "Away!" cried he, one morning, flinging aside the volume of La Rochefoucauld, which he had fancied he understood. "Away with this selfish and debasing code! Men are not the mean things they are here described. Be it mine to think exaltingly of my species. My dear Experience, with how many fine sentiments do you intend to play the devil? It is not without reason that Goethe tells us that though Fate is an excellent, she is also a very expensive school mistress." Ah, my dear Nugent, how are you? And Captain Balfour enters the room, a fine, dark, handsome fellow, with something of pretension in his air, and a great deal of frankness. And here is the horse, come to the window. Does not he step finely? What action! Do you remark his forehand? How he carries his tail? Gad, I don't think you shall have him after all. Nay, my dear fellow, you may well be sorry to part with him. He is superb, quite sound, eh? Have him examined. Do you think I would not take your word for it? The price? Fix it yourself. Prince Paul once offered me 180, but to you shall have it. No, Nugent, say 150. I won't be outdone. There's a draft for 180 pounds. Upon my soul, I'm ashamed, but you are such a rich fellow. John, take the horse to Mr. Nugent's stables. Where will you dine to-day? At the Cocoa Tree? With all my heart. The young men rode together. Nugent was delighted with his new purchase. They dined at the Cocoa Tree. Balfour ordered some early peaches. Nugent paid the bill. They went to the opera. Do you see that danseuse, Florine? Asked Balfour. Pretty ankle, eh? Yes, comme ça. But dances awkwardly. Not handsome. What? Not handsome? Come and talk to her. She's more admired than any girl on the stage. They went behind the scenes, and Balfour convinced his friend that he ought to be enchanted with Florine before the week was out. The danseuse kept her carriage, and in return Nugent supped with her twice a week. Nugent had written a tale for the Keepsake. It was his first literary effort. It was tolerably good, and exceedingly popular. One day he was lounging over his breakfast, and a tall, thin gentleman in black was announced by the name of Mr. Gilpin. Mr. Gilpin made a most respectful bow, and heaved a peculiarly profound sigh. Nugent was instantly seized with a lively interest in the stranger. "Sir, it is with great regret," faltered forth Mr. Gilpin, "that I seek you. I. A low consumptive cough checked his speech. Nugent offered him a cup of tea. The civility was refused, and the story continued. Mr. Gilpin's narration is soon told, when he himself is not the narrator. An unfortunate literary man, once in affluent circumstances, security for a treacherous friend, friend absconded, pressure of unforeseen circumstances, angel wife and 4 cherub children, a book coming out next season, deep distress at present, horror at being forced to beg, generous sentiments expressed in the tale written by Mr. Nugent forcibly struck him, a ray of hope broke on his mind, and voila, the causes of Mr. Gilpin's distress and Mr. Gilpin's visit. Never was there a more interesting personification of the afflicted man of letters than Gregory Gilpin. He looked pale, patient, and respectable. He coughed frequently, and was dressed in deep mourning. Nugent's heart swelled. He placed a bank-note in Mr. Gilpin's hands. He promised more effectual relief, and Mr. Gilpin retired, overpowered with his own gratitude and Mr. Nugent's respectful compassion. "How happy I am to be rich," said the generous young philanthropist, throwing open his chest. Nugent went to a conversazione at Lady Lennox's. Her ladyship was a widow, and a charming woman. She was a little of the blue, and a little of the fine lady, and a little of the beauty, and a little of the coquette, and a great deal of the sentimentalist. She had one daughter, without a shilling. She had taken a warm interest in a young man of the remarkable talents and amiability of Charles Nugent. He sat next her. They talked of the heartlessness of the world. It is a subject on which men of 21 and ladies of 45 are especially eloquent. Lady Lennox complained. Mr. Nugent defended. One does not talk of innocence, it is said, or something like it is said, somewhere in Madame de Pegnier's memoirs, without being sadly corrupted. And nothing brings out the goodness of our hearts more than a charge against the heartlessness of others. An excellent woman, thought Nugent. What warm feelings! How pretty her daughter is! Oh, a charming family! Charlotte Lennox played an affecting air. Nugent leaned over the piano. They talked about music, poetry, going on the water, sentiment, and Richmond Hill. They made up a party of pleasure. Nugent did not sleep well that night. He was certainly in love. When he rose the next morning, the day was bright and fine. Balfour, the best of friends, was to be with him in an hour. Balfour's horse, the best of horses, was to convey him to Richmond, and at Richmond he was to meet Lady Lennox, the most agreeable of mothers, and Charlotte, the most enchanting of daughters. The danseuse had always been a bore. She was now forgotten. It certainly is a delightful world, repeated Nugent as he tied his neckcloth. Some time after the date of this happy day, Nugent was alone in his apartment, walking to and fro, when Colonel Nelmore, an elderly gentleman, well known in society, with a fine forehead, a shrewd, contemplative eye, and an agreeable address, entered the room. To him Nugent poured forth the long list of his grievances, and concluded by begging him to convey a challenge to the best of friends, Captain Balfour. The colonel raised his eyebrows. "But, my dear sir, this gentleman has certainly behaved ill to you, I allow, but for what specific offence do you mean to challenge him?" "For his conduct in general." The colonel laughed. "For saying yesterday, then, that I was grown a darned bore, and he should cut me in future. He told Selwyn so in the bow window at White's." The colonel took snuff. "My good young friend," said he, "I see you don't know the world. Come and dine with me to-day, a punctual 7. We'll talk over these matters. Meanwhile you can't challenge a man for calling you a bore." "Not challenge him? What should I do then?" "Laugh, shake your head at him, and say, 'Ah, Balfour, you're a sad fellow.'" The colonel succeeded in preventing the challenge, but Nugent's indignation at the best of friends remained as warm as ever. He declined the colonel's invitation. He was to dine with the Lennoxes. Meanwhile he went to the shady part of Kensington Gardens to indulge his reflections. He sat himself down in an arbour, and looking moralizingly over the initials, the dates, and the witticisms that hands, long since mouldering, have consigned to the admiration of posterity. A gay party were strolling by this retreat. The laughter and voices preceded them. "Yes," said a sharp, dry voice, which Nugent recognized as belonging to one of the wits of the day. "Yes, I saw you, Lady Lennox, talking sentiment to Nugent. Fie, how could you waste your time so unprofitably? Ah, poor young man, he is certainly bien bête, with his fine phrases and so forth, but 'tis a good creature on the whole, and exceedingly useful." "Useful?" "Yes. Fills up a vacant place at one's table, at a day's warning. Lends me his carriage horses when mine have caught cold, subscribes to my charities for me, and supplies the drawing-room with flowers. In a word, if we were more sensible, he would be less agreeable. His sole charm is his foibles." "Pooh! Jupiter, what a description from the most sentimental of mothers, of the most talented, the most interesting of young men." Nugent was thunderstruck. The party swept by. He was undiscovered. He raved, he swore, he was furious. He go to the dinner to-day? No, he would write such a letter to the lady. It should speak daggers. But the daughter! Charlotte was not of the party. Charlotte, oh, Charlotte, was quite a different creature from her mother, the most natural, the most amiable of human beings, and evidently loved him. He could not be mistaken there. Yes, for her sake he would go to the dinner. He would smother his just resentment. He went to Lady Lennox's. It was a large party. The young Marquis of Austerley had just returned from his travels. He was sitting next to the most lovely of daughters. Nugent was forgotten. After dinner, however, he found an opportunity to say a few words in a whisper to Charlotte. He hinted a tender reproach, and he begged her to sing. "We met, 'twas in a crowd." Charlotte was hoarse, had caught cold. Charlotte could not sing. Nugent left the room. When he got to the end of the street, he discovered that he had left his cane behind. He went back for it, for he was really in love, glad of an excuse for darting an angry glance at the most simple, the most natural of human beings, that should prevent her sleeping the whole night. He ascended the drawing-room, and Charlotte was delighting the Marquis of Austerley, who leaned over her chair with "We met, 'twas in a crowd." Charlotte Lennox was young, lovely, and artful. Lord Austerley was young, inexperienced, and vain. In less than a month he proposed and was accepted. "Well, well," said poor Nugent one morning, breaking from a reverie, "betrayed in my friendship, deceived in my love, the pleasure of doing good is still left to me. Friendship quits us at the first stage of life, love at the second, benevolence lasts till death. Poor Gilpin, how grateful he is! I must see if I can get him that place abroad." To amuse his thoughts he took up a new magazine. He opened the page at a violent attack on himself, on his beautiful tale in the Keepsake. The satire was not confined to the work, it extended to the author. He was a fop, a coxcomb, a ninny, an intellectual dwarf, a miserable creature, an abortion. These are pleasant studies for a man out of spirits, especially before he is used to them. Nugent had just flung the magazine to the other end of the room when his lawyer came to arrange matters about a mortgage, which the generous Nugent had already been forced to raise on his estates. The lawyer was a pleasant, entertaining man of the world, accustomed to the society, for he was accustomed to the wants of young men. He perceived Nugent was a little out of humour. He attributed the cause, naturally enough, to the mortgage, and to divert his thoughts he entered first on a general conversation. "What rogues there are in the world," said he. Nugent groaned. "This morning, for instance, before I came to you, I was engaged in a curious piece of business enough. A gentleman gave his son-in-law a qualification to stand for a borough. The son-in-law kept the deed, and so cheated the good gentleman out of more than £300 a year. Yesterday I was employed against a fraudulent bankrupt. Such an instance of long premeditated, cold-hearted, deliberate rascality. And when I leave you, I must see what is to be done with a literary swindler, who, on the strength of a consumptive cough and a suit of black, has been respectably living on compassion for the last 2 years. Ha! He has just committed the most nefarious fraud, a forgery, in short, on his own uncle, who has twice seriously distressed himself to save the rogue of a nephew, and who must now submit to this loss, or proclaim by a criminal prosecution the disgrace of his own family. The nephew proceeded, of course, on his knowledge of my client's goodness of heart, and thus a man suffers in proportion to his amiability. "Is his name Gilpin?" stammered Nugent. "The same. Oh ho! Have you been bit too, Mr. Nugent?" Before our hero could answer, a letter was brought to him. Nugent tore the seal. It was from the editor of the magazine in which he had just read his own condemnation. It ran thus: "Sir, having been absent from London on unavoidable business for the last month, and the care of the magazine having thereby devolved on another who has very ill discharged his duties, I have the surprise and mortification of perceiving, on my return this day, that a most unwarrantable and personal attack upon you has been admitted in the number for this month. I cannot sufficiently express my regret, the more especially on finding that the article in question was written by a mere mercenary in letters. To convince you of my concern, and my resolution to guard against such unworthy proceedings in future, I enclose you another and yet severer attack, which was sent to us for our next number, and for which I grieve to say the unprincipled author has already succeeded in obtaining from the proprietors a remuneration," etc., etc., etc. Nugent's eyes fell on the enclosed paper. It was in the handwriting of Mr. Gregory Gilpin, the most grateful of distressed literary men. End of section 5. Section 6 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 2, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 6. Harriet Bruce, by Mrs. Child. To be beloved is all I need, and whom I love indeed. Coleridge. My friend Harriet Bruce was a healthy, tall, bold-looking girl, somewhat too large and vigorous for genuine beauty, yet gifted with a speaking expression and a rich perpetual coloring that would have made any other face stylish and attractive. She was no favorite with the gentlemen, but there was an indescribable something about her appearance and manners which always compelled them to inquire who she was. No person ever talked with her without remembering what she said, and every one criticized what they could not forget. Yet it was not intellect that made her unpopular. Had she chosen to affect reckless misanthropy, maudlin sensibility, or any other foppery whereby to distinguish herself, she would have found plenty of admirers and imitators. But in her mind genius was checked by manly philosophy, and she could ill conceal her contempt of those who knew talent only by its most common diseases. The consciousness of mental power that lighted up her eye with such a burning spark of pride, and the expression of scorn forever dancing on her lip corners, ready to embody itself in sarcasm, was unquestionably the true reason why this splendid creature became the pariah of the ballroom. She was a strange sort of Diet Vernon. No, she was not a Diet Vernon either, and as I now remember her, I cannot think of a single character, living or imaginary, whom she did resemble. She fascinated her enemies, but never pleased her friends. Power, power, and, above all, intellectual power, was the constant dream of her wild ambition. To have been sure of Madame de Stael's reputation, she would have renounced human sympathy, and lived unloving and unbeloved in this wide world of social happiness. There was such magnificence in the idea of sending one's genius abroad, like a spark of electricity, to be active and eternal, defying education in its form, duration, and power. Sometimes I talked of love, and reminded her how Madame de Stael herself had become its reluctant victim. On this subject she often philosophized, and always laughed. "Who," said she, scornfully, "who that has felt the gush and the thrill attendant upon fame, would be foolish enough to exchange dominion over many for the despotism of one?" Thus Harriet Bruce reasoned, and thus she actually thought, but I knew her better than she knew herself. Her affections were as rich and overflowing as her mental energies, and her craving for human sympathy was in direct proportion to that intense love of beauty which in her amounted to an intellectual passion. That she would love exclusively and extravagantly I had no doubt, and my penetration soon singled out an object. At a large party I first saw her was George MacDonough, the son of a rich Southerner, first in his class, and in the full flush of manly beauty. I knew by the carriage of his neck that he was a Virginian, and the hauteur with which he received adulation attracted my attention, as the pawing of a high-mettled horse would have done. His conversation with Harriet seemed at first to be of a sober and learned cast, but on her part it soon became petulant. Now and then I heard some remark which seemed to relate to a transmigration of souls, and a continual rise in intellectual existence. "Oh," exclaimed Harriet, "how that idea savors of New England housekeeping! How can a Virginian patronize a theory so economical?" At that moment a very lovely girl entered the room, and the young man did not answer Miss Bruce's question. "Ah, there is the beautiful Baltimorean," said he. "She whom I told you reminded me of that fine engraving of yours, La Belle Suisse." "She is beautiful," said Harriet with unaffected warmth. "Her full dark eyes are magnificent, What a pity it is they are not lighted from within! That expression alone is wanting to fill the measure of her glory." The remark was made to an inattentive listener, for MacDonagh's whole interest was absorbed by the newcomer. A slight shade passed over Harriet's face, but it was too transient to define the emotion in which it originated, and she smiled as she said, "You had best go and talk with your powerful beauty. The body should be where the spirit is." "That reproach is too severe," replied the Virginian. "I meant no reproach," she answered. "I have observed that beauty is your idol, and I wish you to worship it." I did not think Miss Bruce had observed my character sufficiently to form any conclusion with regard to my taste. The pride of the proudest girl in Christendom was roused, and there was something indescribably provoking in her manner as she answered, "I assure you I think you quite a specimen in your way. Society is such a bag of polished marbles, but anything odd is as valuable a study as the specimens of quartz Mr. Symes may bring us. Your modesty has led you into a mistake. I have really taken the trouble to observe you." "Truly, Miss Bruce, you're the most singular girl I ever met," said the offended Southerner. "You never did, said, or thought anything like another person." When a compliment is doubtful, Chesterfield says one should always take it. "Therefore I am obliged to you, Mr. MacDonough," replied Harriet, and so saying she turned abruptly from him and directed her attention to me. During the remainder of the evening I saw no indications of a reconciliation. Harriet danced but once. MacDonough, La Belle Suisse were near her in the set, and they met frequently. The extreme nonchalance with which she now and then exchanged some casual remark led me to suspect that he had obtained more power over her extraordinary mind than any other individual had ever possessed. But Harriet was no trifler, and I do not venture to prophesy. Time passed on, and with it nearly passed the remembrance of this skirmish of words, and the thoughts thereby suggested. My unmanageable friend seldom alluded to the fascinating acquaintance she had formed, and when she did, it was done naturally and briefly. Soon after this I was obliged to be absent for several months. I did not return until 2 days before commencement at college, and Harriet's first exclamation was, "You must go to Mr. MacDonough's room. He is to have the first part, and his friends expect everything from him." "But I thought you considered commencement days very stupid things," said I. "So I do. You know I always said life itself was a very stupid thing. There is no originality above ground. Everything that is true is dull, and everything new is false and superficial. But there is no use in quarreling with the world. It is a pretty good world after all. You must go to hear Mr. MacDonough's opinion of it. I'm sure he will express it eloquently. Then you are on good terms now?" said I. She blushed painfully, excessively, but soon recovered self-command enough to say, "I always thought highly of him. I do not know whether my looks expressed the warning voice my heart was yearning to utter, but I am sure the tone of my assent was reluctant and melancholy." George MacDonough appeared most brilliantly on that memorable day. Graceful and dignified, handsome and talented, he sent a thrill to all hearts alive to the grandeur of thought or the beauty of language. During this scene of triumph I watched the countenance of Harriet Bruce with the keenest interest, and never before did I see a human face through which the soul beamed with such intensity. Genius and pride and joy and love were there. I then thought she was intellectually beautiful beyond anything I had ever seen. Poor Harriet! It was the brightest spot in her life, and I love to remember it. MacDonough's room was crowded, and the compliments he received were intoxicating. But in the midst of it all, I imagined I could see the sparkle of his eyes melt into softness when he met a glance from Harriet. Her looks betrayed nothing to my anxious observation, but once I took notice she called him George, and suddenly corrected herself with an air of extraordinary confusion. Had my friend indulged in habits of girlish trifling, I should no doubt have playfully alluded to this circumstance, but there was something in her character and manners which forbade such officiousness. I watched her with the anxiety of sincere friendship. I knew when she once selected an object of pursuit, her whole soul was concentrated, and I could not believe that the proud Virginian, with all his high hopes and his love of dazzling beauty, would ever marry her. I knew he was a very constant visitor, and I frequently observed lights later than had been usual at Mr. Bruce's quiet habitation, and when he called to bid me farewell a few weeks after commencement, the deep gloom on his countenance led me to think that the pride and apparent indifference of my intellectual friend might have surprised him into love. Weeks and months passed on, and I seldom heard an allusion to the absent MacDonough. Harriet's character and manner seemed changing for the better. The perpetual effervescence of her spirit in some measure subsided, and the vagaries of her fancy became less various and startling. Yet there was ever a chastened cheerfulness of manner, and an unfailing flow of thought. By degrees her seriousness deepened, and at last she could not conceal from me that she was unhappy. I attributed it to the illness of her aged father, for Harriet was motherless, and she cherished her only parent with a double share of love. But when the old man was evidently recovering, and her melancholy still increased, I knew there must be another and a deeper cause. One day as I stood by her, watching her progress in a crayon drawing, around which she had thrown much of her early spirit and freedom, I placed my hand affectionately on her shoulder, and touching her forehead with my lips, said, "You have always told me your thoughts, Harriet. Why not tell me what troubles you now?" She continued her task with a quick and nervous movement, and I saw that her eyes were filled with tears. I gently whispered, "Is George MacDonough the cause?" She gave one shriek, which sounded as if it made a rent in her very soul, and then the torrent of her tears poured forth. It was long before I ventured to say to her, "Then it is as I feared. You do love George MacDonough?" She looked in my face with a strange and fixed expression, as she replied, "I ought to love, and honor, and obey him, for he is my husband." I started. "Your husband? How? When? Where were you married?" "At Providence. Do you remember when I asked you to go with me to Mr. MacDonough's room? And you said, 'So then you are on good terms now?' I have been 3 weeks a wife." "And your father, does he know of it?" "Certainly," she said. "You know I would not deceive him." "Then why was so much secrecy necessary?" "I now think it was not really necessary. At all events, that which needs to be concealed is wrong. But George's parents wished him to marry wealth, and he feared to displease them. He has a moderate fortune of his own, of which he will soon come in possession. When he told my father this circumstance, and that he feared he should be urged to marry against his inclination, my father, in the blindness of his dotage, consented to our immediate union." "Then why are you so unhappy?" I inquired. "You have no doubt that your husband will come and claim you?" "Oh, no. The certificate is in my father's hands, and if it were not, a sense of honor would lead him here. But, oh, to have him come coldly and reluctantly! My heart will break, my heart will break," said she, pressing her hand hard against her forehead, and weeping bitterly. "How could I forget that they who listen to passion rather than to reason must always have a precarious influence on each other?" I tried to console her. She said nothing, but took a package of letters from her desk and handed them to me. Their contents proved the mournful prediction of her fears too true. At first George MacDonough wrote with impatient ardor. Then his letters were filled with amusing accounts of the parties given to La Belle Suisse, whose father had come to reside in their neighborhood. Then he filled his pages with excellent reasons for not visiting her as soon as he intended. And finally, when Harriet bowed down her pride and entreated him, if he valued her reputation, to come soon, he sent a cold, laconic answer, merely stating the time at which he might be expected. Poor Harriet! It was too evident she had thrown away all that made existence joyful. However, I tried to soothe her by the idea that gentleness, patience, and untiring love might regain the affection on which her happiness must now depend. She loved to listen to such words. They were a balm to her heart. Mr. McDonough came at the time he had appointed, and publicly announced his marriage. I did not see their meeting, but during the few months he remained at her father's, I observed his manner was uniformly kind, though frequently absent and constrained. An infant daughter formed a new bond of union, and seemed to be the herald of happier days. The young man watched over the little object with the most intense delight, and Harriet's half-subdued character seemed entirely softened in the doting fondness of a mother and the meek resignation of a wife loved. But not enough beloved. None would have recognized the proud, ambitious, and sarcastic Harriet Bruce. I must not dwell minutely on particulars which I observed closely at the time, and which afterwards sunk deeply into my memory. Young McDonough departed once more to take possession of his estate, and prepare it for the reception of his wife and child. His farewell was affectionate, and his frequent letters seemed to restore my imprudent friend to something of her former buoyancy of soul. The idea of separation from her father was now her principal source of unhappiness. But that trial was spared her. The imbecility of the affectionate old man daily increased, and a few days before his daughter's departure, death relieved him from the expected loneliness. The young husband came, as he had promised, but his manner was colder, and his looks more stern than formerly, though none could say he failed in the fulfillment of his duty. Harriet never spoke of any change. Her manner toward him was obedient and affectionate, but never fond. Her romantic visions of human perfection, her proud confidence in her own strength, were gone, and no doubt she wept bitterly over their mutual rashness, knowing as she did that she was a burden taken up merely from a sense of honor. It is not wonderful her very smile had a look of humility and resignation. Their regrets were, however, kept carefully concealed. Whatever might have been their feelings, both seemed resolved on a system of silent endurance. There was something in this course 1,000 times more affecting than the most pathetic complaints. I shall never forget the anguish I felt when I saw Harriet bid farewell to the home of her childhood, that home where she had ever been an idol and an oracle. The lingering preparation of departure, the heartbroken expression, the reluctant step, the drooping head, and the desperate resolution with which she at last seized the arm of a husband who loved her not, and who was about to convey her among strangers, they are all present to me now. Harriet's letters soon spoke of declining health, and before 3 years had elapsed, she implored me to come to her, if I ever wished to look upon her again in this world of shadows. I immediately obeyed the summons. Things were worse than I then had expected. She was evidently very weak, and though she had everything which wealth could supply, or politeness dictate, the balm of kindness never refreshed her weary and sinking spirit. Mr. McDonough never spoke harshly. Indeed, he seldom spoke at all. But the attentions he paid were so obviously from a sense of duty that they fell like ice drops on the heart of his suffering wife. I heard no reproaches on either side, but a day seldom passed without some occurrence more or less painful to my friend. Once, when little Louisa jumped into her father's arms as he entered, and eagerly exclaimed, "Do you love me, papa?" he kissed her with much fondness, and replied, "Yes, I do, my child." "And mamma, too?" inquired the little creature, with a sort of half-entreating tone, so graceful in childhood. He put her away from him, answered coldly, "Certainly, my daughter." I saw a slight convulsion in Harriet's face and in the motion of her hands, but it soon passed. At another time, when we were searching in his private library for the latest number of the Edinburgh, we discovered on a small open desk the engraving of La Belle Suisse, and near it a newspaper giving an account of the marriage of that young Baltimorean whom George had thought so strongly resembled the picture. The surprise was so sudden that Harriet lost the balance of feelings she had hitherto so well preserved. She rushed out of the room, and it was several hours before I was admitted to her bedside. Fortunately for my sensitive friend, this mental struggle was too fierce to be of long continuance. The closing scene of her life drew near, and to her it seemed welcome as sleep to the weary. Sometimes the movements of reluctant nature were visible in the intense look of love she cast upon her child, and the convulsive energy with which she would clasp the little one to her bosom, but otherwise was all stillness and hope. One day, when she had been unusually ill, and we all supposed she was about to die, she pressed my hand feebly, and whispered, "Will you ask George to see me once more?" I immediately repaired to the library, and told Mr. Macdonough the dying request of his wife. At first he made a motion toward the door, then suddenly checking himself, he said in a determined tone, "I'd better not. It will be painful to both. I will wait the event here." I returned to Harriet, but I had not courage to say her request was refused. She listened eagerly to every sound for a while, then looking in my face mournfully, she said, "He will not come." My tears answered her. She looked up for a moment with an expression of extreme agony, but never spoke again. Section 7.